Omegas are weak. They exist to serve, to submit, to breed. That's what the Alpha King declared to his court the day he seized power. But Celeste Anderson would learn that being underestimated was the greatest weapon an Omega could wield, especially when the monster who enslaved her people turned out to be her fated mate. The truth about fated mates? It's a beautiful lie wrapped in destiny's cruelest joke. Because when the moon goddess binds your soul to the very man who destroyed everything you love, you don't get a fairy tale. You get a choice. Surrender to fate, or fight it with every breath in your body. Celeste chose war. Chapter 1. The Omega Nobody Wanted. The auction block reeked of fear and wolfsbane. Celeste stood in line with 47 other Omegas, their wrists bound in silver chains that burned against skin still raw from the previous night's binding. The metal suppressed their wolves, turned them from predators into prey. Around them, alphas and betas circled like vultures, examining teeth, checking for scars, assessing which Omega would fetch the highest price or provide the most entertainment. Lot 17, the auctioneer barked, his voice echoing through the marble hall of the royal citadel. Female Omega, age 23, silver pine pack origin, no visible scarring, certified fertile by the king's physicians. Celeste kept her eyes on the floor as rough hands grabbed her chin, forcing her head up. An alpha she didn't recognize, some minor lord from the Eastern Territories, studied her face with the detached interest one might show a horse at market. Plain, he grunted, releasing her. Next. The word shouldn't have stung. Celeste had heard it all her life, whispered by the prettier Omegas in her former pack, by the betas who overlooked her in favor of her sister, by her own mother who'd sighed every time she looked at Celeste's unremarkable brown hair and ordinary features. Plain. As if being beautiful was the only currency that mattered in a world that had already decided Omegas were worthless. But plain meant invisible. And invisible meant she'd lasted 3 months longer than most when the Alpha King's forces had swept through the territories, conquering pack after pack, enslaving every Omega they found. Her sister, beautiful, golden Priscilla, had been claimed in the first week. Celeste had hidden in root cellars and attics, had rubbed dirt into her hair and torn her dresses, had made herself so unremarkable that soldiers' eyes slid past her like water off stone, until yesterday, when a beta guard had found her stealing bread from the kitchens of a burned-out pack house. Now she stood on this block, waiting to be sold to whatever alpha had coin enough to buy her. The king approaches, someone whispered down the line. Celeste's heart stuttered. She'd never seen Alpha King Nick Skinner in person, few had, outside his inner court. But she'd heard the stories. How he'd challenged the previous Alpha King to ritual combat and torn out his throat before the old ruler could even shift. How he'd declared war on the traditional pack structure, claiming all Omegas as property of the crown. How he'd executed any Alpha who refused to bend the knee, burning entire pack houses to ash with families still inside. The crowd parted. He was nothing like the monster Celeste had imagined. Oh, he was massive, easily 6.5 feet of pure muscle wrapped in expensive black tactical gear that screamed military precision. His dark hair was cropped short, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass. His presence so overwhelming that every wolf in the room instinctively lowered their heads in submission. But it was his eyes that froze Celeste's blood. Pale silver blue like winter ice over a frozen lake, completely devoid of warmth or mercy. Those eyes swept over the line of Omegas with the bored disinterest of a man who'd seen this ritual 1,000 times. They passed over Lot 15, Lot 16, and then they locked onto Celeste. The world tilted. It hit her like a physical blow, a golden thread snapping into place between them, binding her soul to his with the unmistakable certainty of a fated mate bond. The moon goddess's greatest gift and cruelest curse, forged in the heavens and unbreakable by mortal hands. Every wolf dreamed of finding their fated mate, that one perfect soul designed to complete them. The legends promised eternal love, perfect understanding, a bond so deep that mates would die for each other without hesitation. But the legends never mentioned what happened when your fated mate was a monster. Celeste watched Nick's nostrils flare as he scented the bond, watched recognition flash across his face, followed immediately by something that looked like fury. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides, grabbed her chin with bruising force, and tilted her face toward the light. Her, he said flatly. I'll take this one. The auctioneer stammered. Your Majesty, she hasn't been properly evaluated yet. We have much finer specimens in the premium lots. Did I stutter? Nick's voice dropped to a lethal purr that made every wolf in the room freeze. I said I'll take her. Remove the chains. The silver cuffs fell away. Celeste's wolf surged forward for the first time in months, desperate and starving, reaching for her mate with a need that transcended logic. But Celeste shoved her back down with vicious mental force. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Wouldn't let her traitorous wolf make her vulnerable to the man who'd destroyed everything she'd ever loved. Nick's eyes narrowed, as if he could sense her rejection of the bond. His hand was still on her chin, his touch sending unwanted sparks of electricity racing across her skin. Fated mate bonds were designed to be irresistible. The more you touched, the stronger the pull became. Already Celeste could feel her resolve weakening, her body responding to his proximity in ways that had nothing to do with conscious choice. "What's your name?" he demanded. She could have lied. Should have lied. But something in those cold eyes told her he'd know. And the punishment for lying to the Alpha King was rumored to be creative and prolonged. "Celeste," she whispered. "Celeste Anderson of the Silver Pine Pack." His expression didn't change, but she felt something shift in the air between them. Some terrible recognition that this bond was real, inescapable, and deeply, catastrophically unwanted by both of them. "Well, Celeste Anderson," he said softly, his thumb brushing across her lower lip in a gesture that was both possessive and threatening. "It seems the moon goddess has a twisted sense of humor. Tell me, do you know what happens to Omegas who become the Alpha King's property?" Celeste forced herself to meet his gaze, even as terror clawed at her throat. "I've heard the stories, Alpha King. Then you know that most don't survive their first week in my bed." His smile was a knife wrapped in silk. "But you're special, aren't you? My fated mate. The one wolf in all the territories who's supposed to be perfect for me. So let's make this interesting." He released her chin and stepped back, addressing the crowd with the casual authority of a man who'd never been denied anything in his life. "I'm declaring a new game," he announced. "This Omega will spend 3 nights in my bed. If she survives until dawn on the 4th morning, if she endures everything I choose to do to her, I'll grant her freedom. A full pardon, her Omega status expunged, and safe passage to whatever territory will have her." He turned back to Celeste, his smile widening into something that belonged on a predator, not a man. "But if she breaks before the 3rd night ends, she becomes my permanent property. My toy, my slave. For as long as I decide to keep her alive." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Celeste's legs threatened to give out beneath her. This was worse than being sold. Worse than anything she'd imagined. Because he wasn't just claiming her body, he was turning her survival into entertainment. "Do we have a bargain, little Omega?" Nick extended his hand, palm up, in a mockery of a gentleman's offer. 3 nights of hell, or a lifetime of it. Your choice. Celeste stared at that offered hand. She could refuse, could spit in his face and accept whatever death he dealt her right here, right now. That would be the smart choice, the safe choice. But she thought of Priscilla, claimed by some minor alpha, and likely suffering horrors Celeste couldn't even imagine. Thought of all the other Omegas in those chains, waiting to be sold to men who saw them as disposable flesh. Thought of her mother's last words before the soldiers had dragged her away. "Survive, Celeste. No matter what it costs. Just survive. 3 nights. 72 hours of whatever hell this monster had planned. And then freedom, real freedom. The kind Omegas never got in this new world Nick Skinner had built. She could do this. She was plain, invisible, unremarkable. She'd survived this long by being nothing, by disappearing into the background. Maybe she could disappear for 3 more nights, become so small and insignificant that even the Alpha King's cruelty would slide off her like rain off glass. Celeste placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with crushing strength, the mate bond flaring so intensely that she gasped. Nick pulled her close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in those silver blue eyes, close enough to smell winter pine and gunpowder and something darker she couldn't name. "Brave little thing," he murmured against her ear, his breath hot on her neck. "Or maybe just stupid. We'll find out which." His hand slid to the small of her back, possessive and threatening. "The first night begins tonight. I suggest you pray to the moon goddess who cursed us both, because she's the only one who might show you mercy." He turned and strode toward the exit, dragging Celeste behind him like a trophy. The crowd parted in silence, every face a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. They all knew what happened to Omegas in the Alpha King's quarters. The screams that echoed through the citadel walls. The broken bodies carried out at dawn, as Nick pulled her through the marble corridors of his fortress, past guards who kept their eyes carefully averted and servants who shrank into doorways. Celeste felt the full weight of her choice settling onto her shoulders. She'd just made a bargain with the devil, agreed to let her fated mate, the one wolf the universe had chosen specifically for her torture, her for 3 nights in exchange for freedom. The moon goddess really did have a twisted sense of humor. They reached a set of massive double doors carved with wolves in mid-hunt, their jaws open in eternal snarls. Nick shoved them open with one hand and pulled Celeste into the largest bedroom she'd ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the conquered territories, letting in cold winter light that made the white marble floors gleam like bone. An enormous 4-poster bed dominated the center of the room, its black silk sheets pristine and waiting. Nick released her hand and crossed to a cabinet, pouring himself 2 fingers of whiskey with steady hands. He downed it in one swallow, poured another, and finally turned to face her. "Strip," he said calmly. Celeste's hands shook as they reached for the hem of her tattered dress. This was it, the first test. The first of countless humiliations designed to break her spirit before he even touched her. She could already feel her wolf whimpering, torn between the biological imperative to submit to their mate and the rational terror of what he represented. "Wait," Nick said when her dress was halfway up her thighs. Celeste froze. He crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed her wrists, yanking them away from the fabric. "Did you really think it would be that simple? That I'd just take you like some common Omega from the breeding pens?" He released her and stepped back, his expression unreadable. "The first night's test is this. I'm going to sit in that chair." He gestured to an oversized leather armchair near the fireplace. "You're going to stand right where you are. And we're going to see how long you last before the mate bond drives you to beg me to touch you." Celeste's stomach dropped. He wasn't going to force himself on her. He was going to let the bond do it for him, that cruel biological imperative that made fated mates crave each other's touch, like air that turned separation into physical agony. She'd heard stories of mates who couldn't spend more than a few hours apart without experiencing symptoms. Phantom pains, anxiety so severe it felt like drowning, a desperate need for contact that overrode every other instinct. Nick settled into the chair, whiskey glass in hand, and smiled at her with all the warmth of a snake. "The sun sets in 4 hours. If you can last until dawn tomorrow without breaking, you'll survive the first night." His eyes gleamed with cruel amusement. "But here's the thing about fated mate bonds. Little Omega, the more you resist, the worse it gets. Every minute you deny what your wolf wants will feel like hours. By midnight, you'll be in agony. By 3 in the morning, you'll be willing to crawl across broken glass just to touch my hand." He leaned back, utterly relaxed, utterly in control. "So let's begin your first night in hell, shall we? Let's see just how strong your will really is when your own body becomes your worst enemy." Chapter 2. The First Night's Torment. The first hour was bearable. Celeste stood exactly where Nick had left her, 3 feet from the bed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She focused on her breathing in through the nose, out through the mouth, and tried to ignore the way her wolf paced restlessly inside her mind, whining like a kicked puppy every time she glanced at the Alpha King lounging in his chair. Nick hadn't moved. He'd poured himself a 3rd whiskey and was reading through a stack of documents, signing orders with casual efficiency. Execution warrants. Probably. New laws designed to strip more rights from Omegas. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence at all, and somehow that made it worse. She was just furniture to him, an object he'd placed in his room for his own amusement. The mate bond hummed between them like a plucked string, growing more insistent with each passing minute. Celeste could feel it tugging at her chest, a physical sensation that wanted her to close the distance, to touch him, to let her wolf finally claim what the moon goddess had promised. Her skin felt too tight, her fingers itched. Every breath brought his scent winter pine and gunpowder deeper into her lungs, making her wolf howl with frustrated need. "Just a few steps," her wolf whispered. "He's our mate. He's supposed to protect us, love us. The goddess wouldn't bind us to someone who would truly hurt us." But Celeste knew better. The moon goddess bound souls together based on compatibility. Yes. But also for balance. Light and dark. Strong and weak. And sometimes, the goddess bound predator to prey just to see what would happen when instinct warred with destiny. The second hour was harder. Pain started blooming in Celeste's chest, a deep, aching emptiness that no amount of breathing could fill. Her wolf was clawing at her mental shields now, desperate and irrational, throwing images at her of Nick's hands on her skin, his body covering hers, the sweet relief of surrender. The bond wanted consummation. Wanted them skin to skin, soul to soul, completing what fate had started the moment their eyes met. Nick turned a page in his documents. Signed another warrant. Didn't look up. "You're trembling," he observed casually, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "That's the bond starting to work on you. Right now it's just uncomfortable. In another hour, it'll hurt." By midnight, he finally looked up, those silver blue eyes finding hers with predatory precision. "By midnight, you'll understand why separated mates sometimes choose death over the agony of distance." Celeste bit down on her lower lip hard enough to draw blood. The copper taste grounded her, gave her something real to focus on besides the phantom sensation of Nick's hands ghosting across her skin. "I've survived worse than discomfort, Alpha King. Have you?" He set down his whiskey glass and rose from the chair with liquid grace, every movement screaming lethal power. He didn't approach her, that would have been too kind. Instead, he paced around the room's perimeter, keeping exactly the same distance between them, making her track his movements like prey watching a circling wolf. "Tell me, Celeste Anderson of Silver Pine Pack, what's the worst thing you've survived?" She shouldn't answer. Shouldn't give him ammunition. But the bond was making her thoughts fuzzy, her tongue loose. And suddenly the words were spilling out before she could stop them. "I watched your soldiers burn my pack house with my father still inside," she said flatly. "He was the beta. Too old to fight. Too proud to run. They barred the doors and set fire to the whole structure while the pack watched. I heard him screaming for 3 full minutes before the smoke took him." Nick stopped pacing. "The Silver Pine beta. I remember him. Harold Walls. He spit in my general's face when offered the chance to surrender." He resumed his circuit of the room, utterly unmoved. "Your father died because he chose pride over pragmatism. That's not my cruelty, that's natural selection." The casual dismissal of her father's murder sent white-hot rage flooding through Celeste's veins, momentarily overriding the bond's pull. "Natural selection? You murdered hundreds of wolves who refused to accept your tyranny. You've enslaved an entire designation. You've turned our world into a nightmare where omegas are property and strength is the only thing that matters." Her voice rose despite her best efforts to stay calm. "You're not an Alpha King. You're a Cancer wearing a crown." The words hung in the air like thrown knives. Nick went very, very still. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, sharp and genuinely pleased. There she is, the wolf underneath all that fear and submission. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating off his skin, close enough that the bond screamed at her to reach out, to touch, to take what it promised. "You want to know why I really declared war on the old pack system, little Omega? Why I tore down everything our ancestors built?" He leaned in, his breath ghosting across her ear. "Because the old ways were already broken. Because alphas were treating omegas like disposable breeding stock while preaching about honor and tradition. Because your precious father Beta Harold Walls of Silverpine personally sold 17 omegas to a trafficking ring in the Southern Territories to pay off gambling debts. Did you know that? Did you know the man you're mourning was a coward who sacrificed his own pack members to save his own skin?" Celeste's world tilted. "You're lying." "Am I?" Nick pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "Ask your wolf. The bond makes it impossible for mates to lie to each other. You can feel the truth in my words whether you want to or not." And damn him, she could. The bond carried his certainty like a physical weight, pressing against her chest, confirming what her rational mind wanted desperately to deny. Her father had been a gambler. Everyone knew that. But selling omegas? Trafficking pack members like cargo? The old world was rotten to its core, Nick continued softly, almost gently. And somehow that was worse than if he'd shouted. "I didn't destroy paradise. I burned down a beautiful lie and exposed the ugly truth underneath. At least in my world, the cruelty is honest. Omegas know exactly where they stand. No false promises about protection or honor, just the raw reality of power and submission. He stepped back, breaking the proximity that had been driving Celeste's wolf insane. The sudden distance felt like a physical wound, the bond shrieking in protest. But you're right about one thing. I am a monster. I've done terrible things to secure my throne, and I'll do worse to keep it. The difference between me and the alphas who came before is that I don't pretend otherwise. He returned to his chair, picked up his whiskey, and checked the ornate clock on the mantel. 3 hours until midnight. You're doing better than I expected. Most Omegas would be sobbing by now. Celeste's legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. The pain in her chest had spread to her limbs, a deep ache that felt like her bones were trying to tear themselves apart from the inside. Her wolf was no longer whining, she was howling, throwing herself against Celeste's mental barriers with desperate, mindless need. Every cell in Celeste's body was screaming at her to cross that room, to fall at Nick's feet, to beg for the touch that would make this agony stop. But she stayed where she was. Because if she moved, if she broke this easily, she'd never survive the next 2 nights. And freedom was worth any amount of pain. The 3rd hour was hell. Celeste had stopped thinking in coherent thoughts. Everything had narrowed down to the bond's pull and her determination to resist it. Sweat poured down her face despite the room's winter chill. Her hands ached, from being clenched into fists for so long. The pain had evolved from an ache to a burning sensation that raced through her nervous system like liquid fire. Nick had stopped pretending to read his documents. He was watching her now with clinical interest, the way a scientist might observe a specimen in a controlled experiment. Every few minutes he'd shift in his chair, cross his legs, lean back, rest his chin on his hand, and each tiny movement made the bond flare hotter, reminding Celeste of exactly what she was denying herself. "You're bleeding," he observed. "Your lip. You've bitten through it." Celeste tasted copper, but couldn't make herself care. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the bond's torture. She focused on it, let it ground her, used it to build a wall between her rational mind and her wolf's increasingly frantic demands. "I had an Omega last year," Nick said conversationally. "Not a fated mate, those are rare enough that most wolves never find theirs. But she was beautiful. Trained in all the ways to please an alpha. Spent 3 months in my bed before I grew bored, and sold her to a beta in the Western Territories." He took a slow sip of whiskey. She lasted 45 minutes on the first night before she broke. 45 minutes. Celeste had been standing here for 3 hours. "You want to know what the worst part is?" Nick continued. "It's not the pain. Pain is simple. Your body knows how to process pain. No, the worst part is knowing that the agony you're in right now would end instantly if you just gave in. One touch. One word of submission. That's all it would take." His smile was cruel and knowing. "But your pride won't let you, will it? You'd rather suffer than give me the satisfaction of watching you break." He was right. Goddess help her, he was right. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about proving that he couldn't break her. That somewhere under all the fear and pain and desperate need, there was still a core of Celeste Anderson that belonged to herself and no one else. "Tell me something," Nick said, leaning forward. "Why are you really doing this? Freedom?" He laughed, sharp and bitter. "There's no such thing as freedom for Omegas anymore. Even if you walk out of here in 3 nights, where will you go? What pack will take you in when they learn you're the Alpha King's rejected fated mate? You'll be marked, tainted. A wolf without a home." The words hit harder than any physical blow, because they were true. Celeste hadn't thought past surviving 3 nights. Hadn't considered what freedom actually looked like in a world Nick had rebuilt in his own image. "So I'll ask you again," Nick said softly, dangerously. "Why are you really doing this? What are you trying to prove?" Celeste's voice came out as a whisper, raw and broken. "That I'm not what you made me. That even if the whole world sees me as property, as something to be owned and used and discarded, I still own myself, my choices, my will." She forced herself to meet his eyes, those cold, silver-blue depths that promised nothing but pain. "You can take my body. You can make me suffer. But you can't have the part of me that matters unless I give it to you." For one heartbeat, something flickered across Nick's face, surprise. Maybe, or recognition. or something even more dangerous. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar mask of cruel amusement. "Beautiful words," he said. "Let's see if you still believe them at dawn." The clock struck midnight. The pain intensified to a level Celeste hadn't thought possible. It felt like her soul was being torn in half. One piece desperate to stay anchored in her body, the other trying to cross the room and merge with Nick's. Her wolf had stopped fighting and started begging, sending image after image of submission, of surrender, of sweet relief if Celeste would just give in. Her legs buckled. Celeste hit the floor hard, her hands barely catching her weight before her face smashed into the marble. The cold stone against her burning skin felt like a blessing and a curse. She couldn't stand anymore. Couldn't maintain even that small defiance. All she could do was stay on her hands and knees, gasping for air, fighting not to crawl across the room like the broken Omega Nick expected her to be. "Impressive," Nick said, and for the first time he sounded almost genuine. "Most don't make it past 10 o'clock. He stood, his boots entering her limited field of vision. "But the night's not over, little Omega. You still have 6 hours until dawn. 6 hours on your hands and knees, fighting a battle you can't win." He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. The proximity made the bond sink so close, just reach out and touch him and the pain will stop, but Celeste locked her jaw and stayed exactly where she was. Nick's hand came up slowly, giving her time to see it coming, to understand what he was about to do. He cupped her cheek with surprising gentleness, his thumb wiping away the blood from her bitten lip. The contact sent a shockwave of relief through her body, the bond lighting up like fireworks. Her wolf practically purring with desperate joy. Then he pulled his hand away. The loss of contact was worse than if he'd never touched her at all. Celeste heard a sound escape her throat, something between a sob and a whimper, and hated herself for the weakness even as she couldn't stop it. "That's what you're fighting," Nick said quietly, his eyes boring into hers. "That need, that desperation. The bond will give you just enough relief to remind you what you're missing, then rip it away and leave you bleeding." He stood, towering over her prone form. "This is your last chance, Celeste. Submit now, and I'll make the pain stop. I'll give you everything your wolf is begging for. Or stay on that floor and suffer for 6 more hours, knowing that one word, just one word of surrender, would end this. One word. That's all it would take." Celeste thought of her father burning alive, thought of Priscilla dragged away by soldiers, thought of all the Omegas in chains, waiting to be sold to men who saw them as less than human. Thought of the world Nick had built where strength was the only thing that mattered and weakness was punished without mercy. She thought of 3 nights versus a lifetime. 72 hours versus forever. And she stayed on the floor, silent and suffering, denying him what he wanted most, her willing surrender. Nick studied her for a long moment. Then he did something completely unexpected. He smiled. A real smile this time, not cruel or mocking, but almost impressed. "You magnificent, stubborn fool," he murmured. Then he crossed the room, settled back into his chair, and resumed his vigil, watching, waiting, giving her exactly what she'd asked for, the chance to prove she couldn't be broken. The hours crawled by, like years. Celeste lost track of time somewhere around 3 in the morning. The pain had become her entire universe. Every breath was agony, every heartbeat sent fresh waves of suffering through her body. Her wolf had gone silent, too exhausted to keep fighting, leaving Celeste alone in her own mind with nothing but her determination to hold her together. She counted the stones in the marble floor, traced patterns in the veins of white and gray, focused on anything, everything, nothing, just to keep from thinking about how easy it would be to give in, how sweet the relief would feel, how much her body was begging her to stop this torture and accept what the bond promised. Somewhere in the darkness, before dawn, she started hallucinating, saw her father standing in the corner, his skin blackened by fire, telling her she'd failed him. Saw Priscilla laughing, her golden hair shining, asking why Celeste had always been the weak one. Saw her mother's face twisted in disappointment, whispering that plain, ordinary Celeste had never been meant for anything more than this broken and suffering on a monster's floor. "Stay with me, Omega." Nick's voice cut through the hallucinations like a blade. Celeste blinked and realized he was crouching beside her again, his hand hovering near her face but not touching. Even through the haze of pain, she could see the concern in his eyes, quickly masked, but there for a heartbeat. "Don't you dare pass out," he ordered. "That would be cheating." I said dawn. And I meant conscious at dawn. Fight. Damn you. Why did he care? If she passed out, wouldn't that make it easier for him? But there was something in his voice, something that almost sounded like respect that gave Celeste just enough strength to cling to consciousness. I'm still here, she managed to whisper through cracked lips. Yes, Nick said softly. You are. The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. Golden light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the white marble in shades of amber and rose. Celeste watched it spread across the floor like hope made visible, watched it reach her hands, still pressed against cold stone, watched it touch her face like a benediction. She'd survived. 6 hours of torture that should have broken any sane wolf, and she'd survived. Nick stood and checked the clock. Dawn, he announced formally. The first night is complete. He looked down at Celeste, still on her hands and knees, barely conscious, trembling with exhaustion and residual pain. You can stand now. The test is over. Celeste tried. Her legs wouldn't cooperate. Her arms were shaking too badly to support her weight. She collapsed fully onto the floor, her cheek pressed against marble that still felt blessedly cool against her burning skin. Nick sighed the sound almost fond and did something that shocked her to her core. He bent down, slid his arms under her body, and lifted her with effortless strength. The contact sent the bond singing with relief, her wolf stirring weakly with exhausted joy. He carried her to the massive bed and laid her on top of the black silk sheets with surprising gentleness. Sleep, he ordered, pulling a blanket over her shaking form. You've earned it. Why? Celeste managed to ask through lips so dry they were cracking. Why are you being kind? Nick looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind those silver blue eyes. Because you impressed me, little Omega, and I so rarely find anyone capable of that. He turned toward the door, then paused. 2 nights left. Rest while you can. Tomorrow will be worse. He left her there, alone in his massive bed, as morning light flooded the room, and Celeste finally let herself sink into unconsciousness. She'd survived the first night. But Nick was right about one thing. She had no idea what the next 2 nights would bring. And somewhere in the depths of exhausted sleep, her wolf whispered a terrible truth: she'd survived by fighting the bond. But the bond was getting stronger with every moment they spent together. By the 3rd night, resistance might not be enough. By the 3rd night, she might not want to resist at all. Chapter 3. The Omega's Hidden Strength. Celeste woke to the smell of food and the soft murmur of voices. Her body ached like she'd been trampled by an entire pack, every muscle screaming in protest as she tried to sit up. The bond's pain had receded to a dull throb manageable, barely now that Nick wasn't actively in the room torturing her with proximity. Her wolf stirred weakly, still exhausted from last night's battle, but alive, functioning. They'd survived round 1. She's awake, someone said, a female voice, low and cautious. Celeste forced her eyes open to find 2 women standing beside the bed. Both wore the plain gray dresses that marked them as palace servants, their wrists tattooed with the king's mark of ownership. Omegas, both of them. One was older, maybe 40, with kind brown eyes and silver threading through her dark hair. The other was young, 19 at most, with nervous energy radiating off her like heat. Easy, the older woman said, setting down the tray she'd been holding. Don't try to move too fast. The bond sickness takes time to recover from. Bond sickness. So that's what they called the torture Nick had put her through. Celeste managed to push herself into a sitting position, her hands shaking with the effort. Who are you? I'm Diane Fleming, the older woman said, head of the Omega servants in the King's Wing. This is Cherie Glass, one of my assistants. She gestured to the tray. We brought you breakfast. His Majesty's orders you're to eat, bathe, and rest. He'll return at sunset for the 2nd night. Sunset. That gave Celeste maybe 12 hours to prepare for whatever fresh hell Nick had planned. She looked at the food: fresh bread, cheese, fruit, a bowl of rich stew that made her empty stomach clench with need. When was the last time she'd eaten? Before the auction, probably. 2 days ago. She reached for the bread with trembling hands. How bad was it? Cherie asked suddenly, her eyes wide with morbid curiosity. The first night. We heard, everyone's talking about how you lasted until dawn. No one does that. No one. Cherie, Diane warned. But Celeste saw genuine curiosity in the older woman's eyes too. Fear mixed with hope, like maybe if Celeste could survive. There was hope for all of them. It was hell, Celeste said honestly, tearing off a piece of bread and forcing herself to chew slowly, despite wanting to devour everything on the tray. He didn't touch me, didn't hurt me physically, he just let the bond do the work. Stayed close enough that my wolf could feel him, far enough that the separation pain was excruciating. She swallowed. 6 hours of that. I don't recommend it. Diane sat down on the edge of the bed, her expression knowing and sad. Bond torture. It's his favorite test for new omegas. Most break in the first hour, throw themselves at his feet, begging for relief. The fact that you lasted 6. She shook her head, something like admiration crossing her face. That's why everyone's talking. You're either the bravest omega in the Citadel, or the most foolish. Probably the most foolish, Celeste muttered, reaching for the stew. The first spoonful hit her empty stomach like a blessing. What happens tonight? The second night? The two women exchanged a glance, quick and worried. We don't know, Diane admitted. Every omega's trials are different. The king likes to customize his torments based on what he learns about you. She hesitated, then added quietly. But Celeste, you should know no omega has ever survived all 3 nights. The ones who make it past the first usually break on the second, and the few who've lasted until the third. She trailed off, her eyes haunted. What happened to them? Celeste pressed. Cherie looked away. Diane's voice dropped to barely a whisper. They broke so completely they lost their minds. One threw herself from the tower. Another clawed her own eyes out. The bond can do terrible things when you fight it too hard for too long. It's designed to be unbreakable. Resisting it goes against your fundamental nature. Eventually, that resistance will destroy you. The food turned to ash in Celeste's mouth. She forced herself to swallow anyway. Then why did he offer me this bargain? If he knows I can't win, why give me hope at all? Because that's the cruelty, Diane said softly. Hope makes the breaking worse. If you just accepted your fate, submitted on the first night, you'd be another nameless omega in his collection. But now you've tasted the possibility of freedom. When you finally break, and you will break, Celeste, they all do, it'll hurt so much worse knowing how close you came. Celeste set down the spoon, her appetite gone. You're telling me to give up. I'm telling you to survive. Diane reached out and gripped Celeste's hand with surprising strength. Whatever he asks tonight, whatever test he creates, consider surrendering. A life of servitude is better than a death of madness. And the king? She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. He's not as cruel as the rumors suggest. He doesn't torture for fun. If you submit properly, show genuine obedience, he'll tire of you quickly and reassign you to lighter duties. You could have a decent life here, as his slave, Celeste said flatly. As someone who's alive and sane, Diane countered. That's more than most omegas can claim in this world. Cherie had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. There's another reason everyone's talking about you. About what happened last night. She glanced at Diane, who gave a small nod of permission. His Majesty never stays in the room for bond torture. He sets the parameters, leaves, comes back at dawn to check if the omega survived. But last night, she met Celeste's eyes. He stayed. All 6 hours. Watching you. And near the end, when you started hallucinating, he moved closer. Like he was worried you'd actually die. Celeste's heart stuttered. That doesn't make sense. If I died, he'd just move on to another omega. Not if you're his fated mate, Diane said quietly. Fated mates only happen once in a lifetime. If one dies, the other lives with half a soul for the rest of their existence. No, Alpha, not even our king would risk that lightly. She squeezed Celeste's hand. He needs you to survive these trials. Even as he's testing how far he can push you. That's your advantage, if you're smart enough to use it. Before Celeste could process that revelation, the bedroom doors burst open. A man strode in, tall, lean, with sharp features and eyes that assessed everything in a single glance. He wore the formal uniform of the King's Council, all black with silver insignia marking him as someone important. Behind him trailed another Omega servant carrying a dress bag. "Out," he ordered Diane and Cherie with casual authority. They scrambled to obey, Diane shooting Celeste one last worried glance before disappearing through the doors. The man studied Celeste with open curiosity. "So you're the fated mate everyone's buzzing about. I expected someone more impressive." He circled the bed like a predator assessing prey. "Plain features, ordinary build, nothing particularly special about your scent. What exactly does the moon goddess see in you that warranted binding you to the most powerful alpha in the territories?" Celeste pulled the blanket tighter around herself, suddenly very aware that she was wearing nothing but the tattered dress from yesterday. "Who are you?" "Roman Terry, first counselor to His Majesty, and the closest thing he has to a friend." Roman stopped his circling and fixed her with an intense stare. "I'm here to deliver a message. The second night's trial begins at sunset, you already know that. What you don't know is the nature of the test." He snapped his fingers. The Omega servant stepped forward and unzipped the dress bag, revealing a gown that made Celeste's breath catch. It was stunning deep emerald silk that would cling to every curve, off-shoulder with delicate beading that caught the light like stars. The kind of dress that transformed ordinary women into goddesses. "Tonight there's a formal dinner," Roman explained. "The king's inner circle, his most trusted alphas, and several visiting dignitaries from allied territories. You will attend as His Majesty's companion. You will be dressed, groomed, and presented as his fated mate, a position of honor that most Omegas would kill for." Celeste stared at the dress, confusion warring with suspicion. "I don't understand. Last night he tortured me. Tonight he wants me at a formal dinner? What's the test?" Roman's smile was sharp. "The test, little Omega, is whether you can play the part. You'll sit at the Alpha King's right hand. You'll smile and nod and pretend to be honored by his attention. You'll endure comments from alphas who think Omegas are barely better than livestock. And through it all, you cannot show weakness, cannot flinch, cannot give anyone in that room ammunition to use against either you or the king." He leaned in close, his voice dropping to something almost dangerous. "Because here's what you need to understand by binding to you. His Majesty has made himself vulnerable for the first time in his reign. Every alpha in that room will be watching, judging, looking for signs that his fated mate is weak. If they sense weakness, they'll use it. They'll question his fitness to rule. And if you embarrass him publicly..." Roman's eyes glittered. "Well, let's just say the bond torture will seem like a kindness compared to what he'll do to you in private." Celeste's mouth went dry. "So the test is politics, social performance. The test is whether you can be an asset instead of a liability." Roman straightened. "You have 8 hours to prepare. Diane will help you bathe and dress. There's an etiquette instructor coming at noon to teach you proper behavior, how to sit, how to speak when spoken to, which fork to use for which course. Learn quickly, Omega. Your life may depend on it." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing. The king specifically requested that I warn you tonight he will touch you. Nothing overtly sexual, nothing that would scandalize the court. But he'll need to display possession. A hand on your back, fingers at your neck, maybe a kiss, if the moment calls for it." His smile turned cruel. "The bond will make every touch feel like ecstasy. Try not to moan too loudly in front of the visiting dignitaries. It would be unseemly." Then he was gone, leaving Celeste alone with the beautiful dress, and the sinking realization that tonight's torture would be far more subtle and far more dangerous than last night's physical torment. The next 8 hours passed in a blur of preparation that felt more like battle training than grooming. Diane returned with an entire team of servants. They scrubbed Celeste raw in a marble bath that could have fit 10 people, washing away the grime and sweat of last night until her skin was pink and tender. They dried her with soft towels, then applied oils and lotions that made her skin gleam. A hairdresser spent 2 hours taming her plain brown hair into an elegant updo, weaving in thin silver chains that caught the light. The etiquette instructor arrived exactly at noon, a severe beta woman named Josephina Coyle who looked at Celeste like she was a particularly challenging puzzle. "You have the posture of a field worker," Josephina announced within 30 seconds of meeting her. "Shoulders back, chin up. When you walk, Imagine you're balancing a book on your head, smooth, gliding steps, no bouncing. She circled Celeste with a critical eye. You'll be seated at the king's right hand. That's the position of highest honor. Every eye in the room will be on you. You must appear confident but not arrogant, demure but not submissive, beautiful but not threatening to the alpha females present. That's a lot of contradictions, Celeste muttered. Welcome to court politics, Josephina said dryly. Now, let's discuss table manners. There will be 7 courses. For the next 4 hours, Celeste learned which fork was for salad, which spoon for soup, how to hold a wine glass, how to eat without actually consuming much food apparently. Aristocratic omegas were meant to look decorative, not hungry, and how to deflect intrusive questions with polite non-answers. If someone asks about your pack origins, smile and say, "His Majesty has been generous in welcoming me to court," Josephina instructed. If someone comments on your appearance, and they will accept the compliment graciously but immediately redirect praise to the king. His Majesty's favor makes anyone beautiful. If someone directly insults you, she paused. Do not react. Do not defend yourself. Look to the king and let him handle it. Understood? Celeste nodded, her head spinning with rules and expectations. One final thing. Josephina's expression softened slightly. The Alpha King has enemies in that room tonight. Wolves who smile to his face and plot against him behind closed doors. They'll use you to get to him if they can, a careless word, a moment of weakness, anything they can twist into a weapon. Your job is to give them nothing. Be perfect. Be untouchable. Be the fated mate worthy of the most powerful alpha in the territories. And if I fail? Celeste asked quietly. Josephina's eyes were sad. Then you fail the second night's test. And the king will have no choice but to break you completely to maintain his authority. She touched Celeste's shoulder briefly. Don't fail, child. For both your sakes. By the time sunset painted the sky in shades of blood and gold, Celeste was dressed, groomed, and terrified. The emerald gown fit perfectly, of course it did, probably tailored by some Omega seamstress who'd measured Celeste while she slept. It clung to curves she hadn't known she possessed. The off-shoulder design leaving her collarbones and neck exposed in a way that felt vulnerable and powerful at the same time. The silver chains in her hair caught the light with every movement. Diane had applied subtle makeup that somehow transformed her plain features into something striking. Not beautiful, not like Priscilla had been, but compelling in a way Celeste had never seen in her own reflection. You look like a queen, Cherie whispered, her eyes wide. Celeste looked like someone wearing a very expensive costume, playing a role she had no idea how to perform. But she squared her shoulders, lifted her chin the way Josephina had taught her, and prepared to face whatever nightmare the second night would bring. The bedroom doors opened. Nick stood in the doorway, and for one heartbeat, Celeste forgot how to breathe. He'd traded his tactical gear for formal court attire, a black suit tailored so precisely it looked painted on, silver embroidery at the collar, and cuffs marking his royal status. His dark hair was styled back from his face, emphasizing those sharp cheekbones and that cruel, beautiful mouth. He looked like power incarnate, like a dark god who'd descended to earth just to remind mortals of their place. His eyes swept over Celeste, a slow, assessing gaze that traveled from her face to her exposed collarbones, down the curves highlighted by the emerald silk, back up to meet her eyes. Something flickered in those silver-blue depths. Surprise, maybe, or approval. You clean up better than I expected, he said, his voice carefully neutral. You sound disappointed, Celeste replied before she could stop herself. The corner of his mouth twitched. Come here. It wasn't a request. Celeste crossed the room on legs that threatened to shake, stopped just outside his reach, close enough to feel the bond humming between them, far enough to maintain some scrap of dignity. Nick closed the distance in one step. His hand came up to cup her jaw, the same gesture from last night, but this time he didn't pull away. His thumb traced her cheekbone, sending sparks of electricity racing across her skin. The bond sang with relief, her wolf practically purring at the contact. Tonight, you're mine, he said softly, his breath warm against her lips. My fated mate, my companion, my possession. Every person in that dining hall will see you at my side and understand that I have claimed you. His hand slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, possessive and threatening, but they'll also be watching for weakness. Testing you. Some will try to provoke you into making a scene. Others will attempt to seduce information out of you. And a few, his grip tightened slightly, a few will try to hurt you just to see if I'll defend you or let you suffer. And which will you do? Celeste asked, her heart hammering. Defend me or let me suffer? Nick's smile was sharp and cold. That depends entirely on how well you perform. He released her neck and offered his arm in a mockery of gentlemanly courtesy. Shall we, little Omega? Your first test as the Alpha King's fated mate awaits. Celeste placed her hand on his arm, felt the solid muscle beneath expensive fabric, and let him lead her out of the bedroom and down the marble corridors toward whatever fresh hell he'd designed for her second night. Behind them, Diane and Cherie watched from the doorway. Do you think she'll survive? Cherie whispered. Diane's expression was troubled. I think we're about to find out if an ordinary Omega can hold her own in a room full of predators. And if she can't. She trailed off, shaking her head. Then the moon goddess has made a terrible mistake. And we'll all pay the price for it. Chapter 4. Dinner with Wolves. The grand dining hall was designed to intimidate. Celeste felt it the moment the massive doors swung open, the weight of 50 pairs of eyes turning toward her and Nick as they entered. The hall stretched at least 100 feet, all vaulted ceilings and crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows across walls decorated with tapestries depicting famous battles. A long table dominated the center, already filled with alphas and their companions, all dressed in formal attire that screamed wealth and power. Every single one of them was staring at her. Nick's hand pressed against the small of her back, possessive, claiming. Exactly as Roman had warned. The touch sent the bond flaring to life, warmth spreading through Celeste's body like honey through tea. Her wolf stretched languidly, content for the first time since the mate bond had snapped into place. It took every ounce of Celeste's willpower, not to lean into that touch, not to show how desperately her body craved more contact. Smile, Nick murmured against her ear, so quietly only she could hear. You're supposed to be honored to be here. Celeste arranged her features into what she hoped was a gracious expression, and let Nick guide her toward the head of the table. Conversations had died when they entered. Now they resumed in hushed whispers that carried across the hall like rustling leaves. Can't believe she's actually his fated mate. Just another Omega. What makes her special? Give her 3 days before he breaks her like all the others. Nick pulled out the chair at his right hand, the position of highest honor, just as Josephina had said. Celeste sat with the grace she'd practiced all afternoon, keeping her spine straight, her shoulders back, her hands folded demurely in her lap. Nick took his seat at the head of the table, and immediately the hall fell silent. My lords, my ladies. Nick's voice carried effortlessly across the space, commanding attention without even trying. Thank you for joining me tonight. As you've no doubt heard, the moon goddess has seen fit to grant me a fated mate. His hand found Celeste's on the table, his fingers threading through hers in a display of possession that made several Omegas in the room look away in envy. Celeste Anderson, formerly of Silverpine Pack. Now and forever mine. The way he said that last word mine sent a shiver down Celeste's spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the bond's terrible pull. A toast, called a man halfway down the table older, with gray threading through his dark hair and the confident bearing of someone used to power. To his majesty and his fated mate, may their bond strengthen the realm. Glasses raised, wine flowed. Celeste lifted her glass along with everyone else, took the small sip. Josefina had instructed, never drain your glass, it looks desperate, and tried to ignore the speculative looks being thrown her way. The first course arrived, some kind of delicate soup in bowls so fine Celeste could see through them. She picked up the correct spoon, outer spoon for soup, she remembered, and ate slowly, aware that every movement was being scrutinized. So, Miss Anderson, said a woman seated across from her, beautiful in the way all high-born alphas seem to be, with sharp cheekbones and eyes like chips of amber. Tell us about yourself. It's not every day a common Omega catches the Alpha King's attention. The way she said common made it clear what she thought of Celeste's origins. Nick's hand tightened fractionally on Celeste's, a warning to tread carefully. His Majesty has been generous in welcoming me to court, Celeste replied, using Josephina's exact phrase. I'm honored by his favor. How diplomatic, the woman purred. But surely you have thoughts of your own? Or are you simply content to parrot pretty phrases? Her smile was all teeth. I'm Lynn Donovan, Alpha of the Eastern Shore Pack. I've known His Majesty since he first claimed the throne. We've been close friends for years. The implication was clear. The challenge in Lynn's eyes clearer still. She was staking a claim, warning Celeste that fated mate or not, she had history with Nick that couldn't be erased by the moon goddess's whims. Celeste felt Nick's gaze on her, testing how she'd respond. This was the second night's trial, not physical torture, but social warfare. Every word a potential trap, every silence a possible failure. Any friend of His Majesty's is someone I hope to know better, Celeste said, carefully, keeping her voice warm but not submissive. I'm sure you have insights into his character that would be valuable to me as I adjust to court life. Lynn's eyes narrowed, as if she'd expected Celeste to react with jealousy or insecurity. When neither materialized, she changed tactics. And what exactly did you do in Silver Pine Pack? Before the king conquered it, I mean. Conquered. Not unified, not liberated. Conquered. The word was chosen specifically to remind Celeste that Nick had destroyed her home, killed her father, enslaved her people. I helped in my father's household. Celeste replied evenly, though her heart was hammering. He was the beta. He taught me that loyalty and duty were the highest virtues a wolf could possess. How interesting, drawled the gray-haired man who'd made the earlier toast. I heard the Silver Pine beta refused to surrender. Chose to burn rather than bend the knee. Would you say your father was loyal, Miss Anderson, or simply foolish? The table went silent. Even the servants stopped moving. This was it, the trap. If Celeste defended her father, she insulted Nick's conquest. If she condemned him, she betrayed his memory. Either way, she lost. Nick's thumb stroked across her knuckles, such a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but Celeste felt the bond flare in response. He was… what? Warning her? Encouraging her? She couldn't tell. I would say my father made the choice he felt was right for his honor, Celeste said slowly, picking each word like stepping stones across a raging river. And I would say His Majesty made the choice he felt was right for the realm's future. Both were alphas, acting according to their nature. The fact that those choices led to conflict. She met the gray-haired man's eyes directly. That's simply the reality of war. Someone always loses. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Nick laughed, a genuine sound of surprised amusement that made several wolves at the table startle. Well said, little mate. He raised his wineglass in her direction. To the reality of war, and the wolves wise enough to understand it. The tension broke. Conversations resumed. Celeste released a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. She'd passed the first test, but the night was far from over. The second course came and went, some kind of fish, prepared with sauces Celeste couldn't identify. She ate mechanically, hyper-aware of Nick's presence beside her, his hand occasionally finding her shoulder, her arm, the back of her neck. Each touch was calculated, she realized, timed to coincide with moments when the conversation turned dangerous, as if he was using the bond's pull to steady her, to remind her she wasn't alone in this room full of predators. Or maybe he was just marking his territory, making sure everyone saw that she belonged to him. I must say, Your Majesty, said a young alpha near the middle of the table, we were all surprised by your announcement. A fated mate, after all these years? He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Some of us had begun to think you'd never find yours, that perhaps the moon goddess had decided you were better suited to rule alone. The goddess's timing is her own, Toby, Nick replied mildly. Though I appreciate your concern for my personal life. Toby Maddox. Celeste recognized the name from the list of Nick's inner circle that Roman had drilled into her during preparation. Young, ambitious, recently elevated to control the Northern Territories. Loyal to Nick, but only as long as it served his interests. Of course, Your Majesty. Toby's gaze slid to Celeste, calculating. I simply wonder, given Miss Anderson's humble origins, whether she fully understands the responsibilities that come with being the Alpha King's mate. The politics, the expectations, the danger, there it was. The subtle questioning of her fitness. The implication that Nick had made a mistake binding himself to someone so far beneath his station. I'm learning, Celeste said before Nick could respond. His Majesty has been patient with my education. She turned to look directly at Toby, channeling every ounce of confidence she didn't feel. Though I find that understanding politics isn't so different from understanding pack dynamics. Both require knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to recognize a threat dressed in friendly words. Toby's eyes hardened. Lynn Donovan made a small sound that might have been a laugh or a scoff, and Nick's hand slid to Celeste's thigh under the table, his grip possessive and approving. Indeed, he said softly, danger threading through his voice like silk over steel. My mate is proving to be a quick study. I'd advise everyone at this table to remember that what belongs to me is protected by me. Any insult to her is an insult to the crown. Any threat to her is a threat to my rule. His smile was cold enough to freeze blood. And we all know how I handle threats to my rule. The message was received. Conversations shifted to safer topics, trade routes, border disputes, anything that didn't involve directly challenging the Alpha King's fated mate. But Celeste could feel the resentment simmering beneath the surface. She'd made enemies tonight. Lynn Donovan, who saw her as competition for Nick's attention, Toby Maddox, who'd been publicly humiliated, and probably a dozen others who resented an Omega, especially a common one rising to a position of power simply because the moon goddess had decided to play matchmaker. The third course arrived, then the fourth. Celeste's face ached from maintaining her gracious expression. Her body thrummed with tension from Nick's constant touches, the bond singing with desperate need every time his skin met hers. She wanted to lean into him, to let his presence overwhelm her senses, to surrender to what the bond promised. But she couldn't. Not here. Not in front of all these watching eyes. You're doing well, Nick murmured during a lull in conversation, his lips close enough to her ear that his breath made her shiver. Better than I expected. Is that the test? Celeste whispered back. Surviving dinner with wolves? Partly. His hand traced up her spine, a slow, deliberate caress that made her breath catch. But also this enduring my touch without breaking. The bond is strongest in public displays. Every time I touch you in front of witnesses, it reinforces the claim, makes the pull harder to resist. His fingers found the sensitive spot at the base of her skull, applying just enough pressure to make her wolf whine with need. By the time this dinner ends, you'll be so desperate for more contact you'll barely be able to walk. That's tonight's real torture, little mate. Not the politics. The wanting. Celeste's nails dug into her palms under the table. He was right. Every touch built on the last, the bond's heat accumulating, until her entire body felt like it was burning from the inside out. Her wolf was no longer content with these brief, public caresses. She wanted skin to skin, wanted to be claimed properly, thoroughly, the way fated mates were supposed to complete their bond. I hate you, Celeste breathed, though even she could hear how the words lacked conviction. Nick's laugh was dark and knowing. No, you don't. That's the problem. The bond won't let you hate me no matter how much you want to. All it knows is that I'm yours, and you're mine, and we're fighting the most fundamental truth of our existence. His hand slid back down to rest on her shoulder, a possessive weight that somehow felt like the only thing anchoring her to reality. But keep fighting, Celeste. I'm enjoying watching you struggle. The fifth course came some kind of meat dish that Celeste barely tasted. She was too focused on not revealing how Nick's proximity was affecting her, how every casual touch was building an ache between her thighs that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with need. Your Majesty, said a voice from down the table an older Alpha Celeste didn't recognize. Perhaps you'd honor us with the story of how you met your fated mate? It must have been quite the moment. Nick's expression revealed nothing. We met at the Omega auction. The bond snapped into place the moment our eyes met. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if falling in love at first sight while one person was in chains was completely normal. I knew immediately she was mine. How romantic, Lynn Donovan said dryly. Nothing says true love like property acquisition. Several people choked on their wine. Nick's expression went dangerously still. Celeste felt his muscles tense under her hand where it rested on his arm, felt the barely leashed violence in him as he considered how to respond to that blatant disrespect. This was her moment. Her chance to prove she wasn't just a weak Omega who needed his protection. Celeste turned to face Lynn directly, her voice clear and steady, despite her racing heart. You're right, Alpha Donovan, she said calmly. It's not romantic, but then, The moon goddess doesn't deal in romance, she deals in necessity, in balance, in binding wolves together who need each other, even when they don't want to. She held Lin's gaze, refusing to look away first. His Majesty could have chosen any Omega in that auction, beautiful ones, trained ones who would have made this transition far easier for him politically. But the bond chose me, plain, common me from a conquered pack. She smiled, sharp and knowing. So perhaps instead of questioning the goddess's wisdom, we should all be wondering what she saw in this pairing that we're too blind to recognize. Silence crashed over the table like a wave. Lin's face had gone pale with rage. Toby looked like he'd swallowed glass. Even the gray-haired man who challenged her earlier was staring at Celeste with something approaching respect. Nick's hand tightened on her shoulder, not a warning this time, but pure approval. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. My mate makes an excellent point. The moon goddess's decisions are not subject to court approval or popular opinion. Celeste Anderson is my fated mate. She sits at my right hand. And anyone who questions that questions the divine order itself. His smile was all predator. Lyn, perhaps you'd like to continue that line of inquiry? I'm always interested in hearing which of my subjects consider themselves wiser than the goddess. Lyn's jaw clenched. Of course not, Your Majesty. I apologize for any disrespect. The words came out strained, forced through gritted teeth. Apology accepted. Nick's hand slid from Celeste's shoulder to wrap around her waist, pulling her closer against his side. Now, shall we continue with the meal? I believe dessert is next. The final courses passed in a blur. Celeste was running on pure adrenaline now, her heart racing, her skin hypersensitive to every brush of Nick's hand. She'd done it. She'd held her own against wolves who'd been playing court politics since before she was born. She'd defended herself and Nick's choice without his intervention. She'd survived the second night's trial. Or so she thought. When the dinner finally, mercifully ended, Nick stood and offered Celeste his hand. Walk with me. It wasn't a request. Celeste placed her hand in his and let him lead her out of the dining hall, through corridors lit by torches that cast dancing shadows on marble walls. She thought he was taking her back to his chambers, back to whatever punishment or reward awaited her for tonight's performance. Instead, he led her to a balcony overlooking the conquered territories. The night air was cold, biting through the thin silk of her gown. Below them, the citadel spread out like a spider's web, all sharp angles and defensive walls, built to withstand siege. In the distance, she could see the lights of the city, the territories Nick had claimed through blood and fire. You surprised me tonight, Nick said quietly, his hands braced on the balcony railing. The way you handled Lyn, the way you defended our bond without defending me personally. He turned to look at her, those silver blue eyes reflecting starlight. You're not what I expected from a fated mate. What did you expect? Celeste asked, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold. Weakness. Submission. Someone who would fold at the first sign of opposition. Nick shrugged off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, a surprisingly gentle gesture that sent the bond singing with warmth. Instead, I got a wolf with a spine of steel and a tongue sharp enough to cut. His smile was complicated, equal parts admiration and frustration. You're going to be trouble. Celeste Anderson. Is that why you're doing this? The words escaped before Celeste could stop them. The 3 nights, the trials. Are you trying to break me because I'm not what you wanted? Nick was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and honest in a way she hadn't heard before. I'm doing this because I don't know what else to do with you. He turned to face her fully. I've spent years building a reputation as the monster alpha, the ruthless conqueror, the king who rules through fear and power, and then the moon goddess binds me to an Omega from a pack I destroyed. An Omega who looks at me like I'm both her salvation and her damnation. His hand came up to cup her cheek. If I'm soft with you, I show weakness. If I'm cruel, I betray the bond. So I test you, push you. See if you'll break or bend or somehow find a third option I haven't considered. His thumb traced her lower lip, the same gesture from that first night, but gentler now. The bond flared between them, stronger than ever after hours of public touching, demanding completion, demanding more. What happens if I survive all 3 nights? Celeste whispered. I give you your freedom, Nick said, just as I promised. You walk away from here, from me, from the bond, and I spend the rest of my life with half a soul, wondering what might have happened if you'd chosen to stay. And if I break? His expression turned dark. Then I keep you, make you mine in every way that matters, and eventually, the part of you that's fighting so hard right now will disappear, worn away by the bond in time, and the reality that resistance is futile. His hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. You'll become what every other Omega in my court is: beautiful, obedient, and empty. The words should have terrified her. Should have made her pull away, reinforce her determination to survive the final night and escape this nightmare. But standing here in the cold night air, Nick's jacket warm around her shoulders and his hands gentle on her skin, Celeste felt something shift inside her chest. She didn't want to break, but she also didn't want to leave. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere between the first night's torture and tonight's social warfare, something had changed. The bond had burrowed deeper than she'd thought possible, making her hyper-aware of Nick as more than just her captor. She saw the intelligence behind his cruelty, the loneliness beneath his power, the way he'd protected her tonight even while testing her, his touches both possessive and strangely comforting. One more night, Nick murmured, his forehead resting against hers. One more test, and then we'll both know if the moon goddess made a mistake binding us together. He kissed her then, not the brutal claiming she'd expected, but something slower, deeper. A kiss that tasted like promise and threat, and desperate, aching need. The bond exploded between them, flooding Celeste's body with heat and want and the terrible certainty that this was what she'd been made for. This wolf. This moment. This impossible choice between freedom and fate. When Nick finally pulled back, his eyes were molten silver. Go back to my chambers. Rest. Tomorrow night. He smiled, dangerous and knowing. Tomorrow night, I'll show you what it really means to be the Alpha King's fated mate. Then he was gone, leaving Celeste alone on the balcony with his jacket still wrapped around her shoulders and the taste of him on her lips. She'd survived the second night, but as she walked back through empty corridors toward Nick's chambers, Celeste couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just lost something far more important than a battle of wills. She'd started to fall for the monster who destroyed her world, and that made the final night's trial infinitely more dangerous than any torture Nick could devise. Chapter 5. The Truth Beneath the Crown. Celeste didn't sleep. She lay in Nick's massive bed, wrapped in sheets that smelled like winter pine and gunpowder, staring at the ceiling as her mind replayed every moment of the dinner. Every touch. Every word. That kiss on the balcony that had tasted like surrender and victory all at once. Her wolf was restless, pacing inside her mind with anxious energy. The bond had grown stronger with each passing hour, each calculated touch, until now it felt less like a tether and more like a lifeline. Being separated from Nick, even just across the citadel, created a dull ache in her chest that made breathing difficult. This was what Diane had warned her about. The bond breaking down her resistance, making her crave the very wolf she should be running from. The bedroom door opened near dawn. Celeste sat up, heart hammering, expecting Nick. Instead, Roman Terry stepped inside, carrying a tray with breakfast and a familiar dress bag draped over his arm. Good morning, almost free Omega, he said with false cheer. Sleep well? What do you want, counselor? Celeste pulled the blanket tighter around herself, suddenly very aware she was wearing only the slip she'd changed into after returning from the balcony. Roman set down the tray and studied her with those sharp, assessing eyes. To deliver a warning, and perhaps some unsolicited advice. He crossed to the window, looking out over the territories as dawn light painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. You did well last night. Better than well, actually. You made Lynn Donovan look like a jealous fool and impressed several council members who'd been betting on your failure within the first hour. Why do I sense a but coming? But, Roman continued, you also painted a target on your back. Lynn has allies, powerful ones who don't appreciate seeing their faction humiliated by a common Omega, and Toby Maddox isn't the type to forget a slight, even a subtle one. He turned to face her. If you survive tonight, if the king actually grants you freedom as promised, those wolves will be waiting, They'll see you as a loose thread that needs cutting before you can be used against His Majesty. Celeste's stomach clenched. So I'm trapped either way. Stay and become his slave. Leave and become a target. There is a third option. Roman moved closer, his voice dropping. Complete the bond. Choose to stay, not as his prisoner, but as his mate, his equal. The Alpha Queen this realm desperately needs. I'm an Omega, Celeste said flatly. We can't be Alphas. It's biologically impossible. Alphas and Omegas are designations of dominance, not destiny, Roman countered. And fated mate bonds transcend normal pack hierarchy. If you and the king completed the bond fully, if you accepted him as your mate, and claimed him in return, you'd share his authority. His power would become yours, his enemies would become your enemies, and his protection. Roman's smile was sharp. His protection would be absolute. Celeste stared at him. You're telling me to give up, to surrender. I'm telling you to see the bigger picture. Roman sat on the edge of the bed, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. Do you know why His Majesty really declared war on the old pack system? Why he tore down centuries of tradition and made himself into the monster every wolf fears? Because he's a tyrant who craves power. Because his sister was an Omega. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Celeste's breath caught. What? Roman's voice went quiet, almost gentle. Her name was Natasha, Nick's younger sister by 3 years. She was beautiful, kind. Everything an Omega was supposed to be according to the old traditions. When she presented at 16, their father, who was alpha of one of the largest packs in the territories, was thrilled. He arranged a marriage to a powerful alpha from an allied pack, told Natasha it was her duty, her honor. He paused, pain flashing across his face. The marriage lasted 6 months. The alpha beat her, raped her, treated her like property because that's what Omegas were under the old system, breeding stock with no rights and no recourse. When Natasha tried to run, her husband dragged her back. When she begged Nick for help, their father forbade him from interfering. Said it would dishonor the alliance, would make their pack look weak. Celeste felt tears burning behind her eyes. What happened to her? She threw herself from a tower 3 days before her 17th birthday. Roman's voice was hollow. Nick found her body, held her while she died, and in that moment, something inside him broke. Or maybe it crystallized. He challenged his father to ritual combat that same night, killed him in front of the entire pack. Then he declared war on every alpha who'd stood by and let his sister suffer, who'd defended a system that treated Omegas as disposable. Roman met Celeste's eyes. Nick didn't conquer the territories because he wanted power. He did it because he wanted to burn down a world that killed his sister. And yes, he's become a monster in the process. Yes, he's done terrible things, but every Omega he's claimed as crown property, they're protected by royal decree. No alpha can touch them without his permission. No one can beat them or kill them or drive them to suicide. They're slaves, yes, but they're alive. And in Nick's mind, that's better than what the old system offered. Celeste's mind reeled. Everything she thought she knew about Nick, about his motivations, his cruelty, his reign of terror shifted like sand under her feet. He wasn't just a tyrant. He was a broken wolf who'd watched someone he loved be destroyed by tradition, and then remade the world so it could never happen again. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Because tonight's trial is the hardest one, Roman said. And you need to understand what's really at stake. If you walk away after tonight, Nick loses his fated mate, the one wolf the moon goddess designed specifically for him. He'll survive. He's too stubborn to die from a broken bond, but he'll never be whole again. Never have the chance at the connection every wolf dreams of. Roman stood, pulling the dress bag closer. But if you stay, if you choose him despite everything he's done, everything he represents, you could be the thing that finally heals him. That turns the monster back into a wolf capable of something more than rage and vengeance. He headed toward the door, paused at the threshold. The choice is yours, Celeste. It always has been. Just make sure you understand what you're really choosing between. Then he was gone, leaving Celeste alone with her spinning thoughts and the breakfast growing cold on the tray. The day passed in a strange, suspended tension. Diane and Cherie came to help her bathe and dress, but their usual chatter was subdued. They'd heard about the dinner everyone had, apparently. The story of how a common Omega had put Lynn Donovan in her place was spreading through the citadel like wildfire. "You're either very brave or very foolish," Diane said as she brushed Celeste's hair. "Lynn doesn't forgive slights. And she has the Eastern Shore pack at her command." "The king will protect her," Cherie insisted, her voice holding a faith Celeste wasn't sure she shared. "The king has enemies of his own," Diane countered. "He can't be everywhere at once." "And Celeste." She met Celeste's eyes in the mirror. "If you take your freedom tonight, you'll be vulnerable. No pack. No protection. Just a lone Omega marked as the Alpha King's rejected mate." "Maybe that's a risk worth taking," Celeste said. But even she could hear the doubt in her voice. By the time sunset approached, Celeste was dressed in yet another gown, this one simpler than last night's, deep burgundy silk that wrapped around her body like a second skin. Her hair hung loose down her back in waves. Cherie had spent an hour perfecting. She looked like someone else in the mirror. Someone strong. Someone who could be a queen. But when she looked closer, she still saw plain Celeste Anderson from Silverpine Pack, the Omega nobody wanted. The invisible girl who'd spent her whole life in her sister's shadow. The bedroom doors opened. Nick stood there, but not the formal Alpha King from last night. He'd traded his suit for simple black pants, and a loose shirt that revealed the strong column of his throat. His hair was tousled, his feet bare, and for the first time since Celeste had met him, he looked young, vulnerable, almost human. "It's time," he said quietly. Celeste's heart hammered. "What's the final trial?" "The truth." Nick held out his hand. "Come with me." She placed her hand in his, felt the bond sing at the contact, and let him lead her through corridors she'd never seen before. Down, down, down stone stairs that descended into the heart of the citadel, past guards who averted their eyes, through doors sealed with locks that required Nick's blood to open. Finally, they emerged into a chamber that took Celeste's breath away. It was circular, maybe 50 feet across, with walls made entirely of glass. Beyond the glass, Celeste could see water. They were underwater, she realized with shock. Some kind of submerged chamber beneath the citadel. Fish swam past the windows, their scales catching light from bioluminescent plants that grew along the walls. But it was what stood in the center of the chamber that made Celeste's throat close. A memorial, simple and heartbreaking. A statue of a young woman with her face turned toward the sky, her arms outstretched as if she was trying to fly. Flowers surrounded the base, fresh ones, replaced regularly. And carved into the stone pedestal were words that made Celeste's eyes burn. "Natasha Skinner, beloved sister, the wolf who deserved better. This is where I come when I need to remember why I'm doing all of this," Nick said quietly, his voice echoing in the silent chamber. "When the crown feels too heavy and the choices too dark, I come here and I remember Natasha. Remember the sister who should have lived to see a better world." He released Celeste's hand and walked to the statue, pressing his palm against the stone. "Roman told you about her. I could smell it on you, the change in how you looked at me. The pity." He turned to face her, and for the first time, Celeste saw real emotion in those silver blue eyes, pain so deep it had turned into something else entirely. "I don't want your pity, Celeste. I want you to understand." "Understand what?" Celeste whispered. "Why the final trial is this." Nick gestured to the chamber, to the memorial, to himself standing broken in front of his sister's statue. No torture. No tests of strength or wit or social grace. Just honesty. The one thing I've never been able to give anyone, because showing vulnerability means showing weakness, and weakness gets you killed in the world I've built. He crossed the distance between them, cupped her face in both hands, and Celeste saw something she never expected to see in the Alpha King's eyes: fear. "I'm giving you the truth, little mate. All of it. And then you're going to make your choice knowing exactly who and what I am." His thumb traced her cheekbone. "Not the monster. Not the king. Just me. Nick Skinner, the wolf who broke the world trying to save it, and isn't sure anymore if he did the right thing." Comment: what would you do in Celeste's position? Walk away from a monster with a tragic past, or stay and try to heal him? He released her and stepped back, his hands falling to his sides. When he spoke again, his voice was raw. "I didn't want a fated mate. Didn't want the moon goddess tying my soul to anyone after what happened to Natasha. Love makes you weak. Makes you vulnerable. Gives your enemies ammunition. He laughed, bitter and broken. And then I saw you on that auction block. Felt the bond snap into place. And for the first time in 8 years, I felt something other than rage and emptiness. What did you feel? Celeste asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hope. The word came out like a confession. Terrible. Unwanted hope that maybe the goddess hadn't abandoned me completely. That maybe there was still a chance at something other than the cold, isolated existence I've built. His eyes met hers, and Celeste saw past the monster to the wolf underneath, lonely and broken and so desperate for connection he'd built walls of cruelty to protect himself from it. So I tested you, Nick continued, pushed you to see if you'd break like everyone else. If you'd prove that hope was just another lie. He smiled, sad and knowing. But you didn't break. You fought. You survived. You looked at me like I was both the answer and the question. Salvation and damnation all wrapped up in one impossible package. He moved closer. Close enough that Celeste could see gold flecks in his silver blue eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his skin. And now I'm standing here in front of my dead sister's memorial, about to give you the choice I never gave any other Omega. The choice Natasha never got. What choice? Celeste's heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear her own voice. Stay or go. But know this, if you stay, it won't be as my slave or my prisoner or some broken Omega I keep for entertainment. His hands came up to frame her face again, gentle and desperate. If you stay, it'll be as my mate. My equal. The Alpha Queen who rules beside me and reminds me every day that strength isn't the only thing that matters. He rested his forehead against hers, and Celeste felt the bond between them thrumming like a living thing stronger than ever, demanding completion, begging them both to stop fighting what fate had decided. But if you go, Nick whispered, I'll keep my word. I'll give you freedom. Safe passage. Enough coin to start a new life somewhere far from here. And I'll spend the rest of my existence with half a soul, wondering what might have happened if you'd chosen differently. He pulled back, his hands falling away, leaving Celeste cold and aching with their absence. So that's the final trial, Celeste Anderson. Not pain or politics or social warfare. Just a choice. The hardest choice either of us will ever make. Choose me, he said, his voice breaking on the words. Please, choose the broken wolf who's offering you a crown and a kingdom and a love that will consume us both. Or choose freedom and prove that I was right all along, that hope is just another beautiful lie. The chamber fell silent except for the soft sound of water against glass, and Celeste's ragged breathing. She stood frozen, her mind spinning, her heart torn between terror and longing and the terrible certainty that whatever she chose in this moment would define the rest of her life. She thought of her father burning, her sister enslaved, the Omegas in chains, the world Nick had built through blood and fire. But she also thought of Natasha, of a young Omega, driven to suicide by a system that saw her as property, of a brother who'd broken the world trying to avenge her and ended up becoming the very thing he'd fought against. And she thought of the wolf standing in front of her now, not the Alpha King who'd conquered the territories, but Nick Skinner, the wolf who came to this underwater chamber to remember his sister, who'd shown her vulnerability when it could have gotten him killed, who was offering her a choice when he could have just taken what he wanted. The bond pulled at her chest, insistent and undeniable. Her wolf was no longer fighting or begging. She was simply waiting, trusting Celeste to make the right decision for both of them. Celeste took a deep breath, steadied herself, and made her choice. I need you to answer one question first, she said, her voice stronger than she felt. And I need the truth, not what you think I want to hear. Nick went very still. Ask. If I stay. If I become your mate and your queen and everything you're offering, will you change? Will you stop enslaving Omegas? Will you build something better than the world you've created? For a long moment, Nick didn't answer. Then he smiled, sad and honest, and more real than anything she'd seen from him before. I don't know, he said quietly. I've been the monster for so long I'm not sure I remember how to be anything else. But... He reached out, took her hand, pressed it over his heart, where she could feel it hammering against his ribs. With you beside me, maybe I could learn. Maybe you could be the conscience I've been missing. The voice that reminds me there's more to leadership than fear and power. He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles with devastating gentleness. I can't promise to be perfect, Celeste. Can't promise to suddenly become the hero instead of the villain. But I can promise to try. To listen when you tell me I'm wrong. To build something with you instead of just destroying everything that came before. It wasn't the answer she'd hoped for. But it was honest. Real. More than any other Alpha would have given her. Celeste looked at the statue of Natasha at the young Omega, who died because the old world had no place for wolves like her. Then she looked at Nick at the Alpha King who'd burned that world down, but didn't know how to build something better in its place. She thought of 3 nights. Of torture and trials and tests that had pushed her to breaking. Of a bond that refused to let her go no matter how hard she fought it. And she realized something that should have terrified her but instead felt like coming home. She didn't want to fight it anymore. I choose you, Celeste said, the words falling from her lips before fear could stop them. Not because the bond demands it. Not because I'm afraid of what happens if I leave. But because… She met his eyes. Let him see the truth in hers. Because I think we're both broken wolves trying to survive in a broken world. And maybe together, we can figure out how to heal. Both ourselves and this realm you've conquered. For one heartbeat, Nick stood frozen. Then he moved fast and desperate, pulling her against him with bruising force. His lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted like relief, and need and 8 years of loneliness finally breaking apart. The bond exploded between them. Not the controlled flares from public touching or the torture of separation. This was complete, overwhelming, all-consuming. Celeste felt Nick's soul reaching for hers, felt the mate bond locking into place with an almost audible click, and suddenly she wasn't just Celeste anymore. She was part of something larger, something that transcended pack and designation, and every rule she'd ever been taught. She was his. He was hers. And nothing in this world or any other could ever break them apart. When Nick finally pulled back, his eyes were molten silver, and his hands were shaking where they gripped her waist. Say it again, he demanded, his voice rough. Tell me you're staying. I'm staying, Celeste whispered. I'm choosing you, Nick Skinner. Monster and king and broken wolf, all of it. His smile was blinding. Then let me choose you too. He dropped to one knee in front of Natasha's memorial, took Celeste's hand in both of his, and spoke words that had more power than any royal decree. I, Nick Skinner, Alpha King of the Unified Territories, claim you, Celeste Anderson, as my fated mate, not my property, not my slave, my equal, my queen, the wolf who will stand beside me and remind me every day what I'm fighting for. He stood, pulled a ring from his pocket, simple silver with a moonstone that caught the underwater light. This was Natasha's, the only thing of hers I kept. I want you to have it. Want my sister to be part of what we're building together. Celeste's vision blurred with tears as Nick slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for her hand. Like even Natasha was blessing this impossible union. I accept your claim, she said, the formal words feeling right in this moment. And I claim you in return. Not just your title or your power, but you, the wolf who's been alone for too long. The bond flared again, sealing their choice, making it irrevocable. Celeste felt something shift inside her chest, a surge of power that wasn't hers, flowing through the mate bond from Nick. Alpha strength. Authority. The weight of a crown she'd never asked for but suddenly understood was hers to wear. Welcome to forever, little mate, Nick murmured against her lips. I hope you don't regret this choice. I hope you don't regret giving me a crown, Celeste replied. Because I have ideas about how to change this world. And you did promise to listen. Nick's laugh was genuine and warm. I did, didn't I? Goddess help me. I've just given political power to a wolf who put Lynn Donovan in her place during her first court dinner. He kissed her again, slower this time, deeper. We're going to be magnificent together, or we're going to burn this entire realm to ash. Possibly both. Both sounds about right, Celeste agreed. And there, in an underwater chamber beneath a conquered citadel, in front of a memorial to a dead Omega who deserved better, Celeste Anderson made peace with her choice. She'd survived 3 nights, she'd earned her freedom, and then she'd chosen to stay anyway. Not because the bond demanded it. Not because she was weak or broken or afraid, but because sometimes the bravest thing a wolf could do was choose love over fear, hope over bitterness, and the possibility of healing over the safety of solitude. Even when that love came wrapped in shadows and smelled like winter pine and gunpowder. Even when choosing it meant becoming a queen in a kingdom built on blood. Even when the wolf she'd chosen was both her salvation and her damnation, her mate and her mirror, the monster who destroyed her world and the only one who could help her build something better from the ashes. Chapter 6. The Queen's First Decree. The announcement came at dawn. Celeste stood on the balcony overlooking the citadel's main courtyard, Nick's hand warm and steady at her waist, as Roman Terry addressed the assembled crowd below. Hundreds of wolves, alphas, betas, omegas, all gathered to hear the Alpha King's proclamation. By the power vested in me as first counselor. Roman's voice carried across the courtyard with practiced authority. I declare before the moon goddess and all witnesses that Alpha King Nick Skinner has completed the mate bond with Celeste Anderson. She is no longer property of the crown. She is the crown. Your Alpha Queen with all rights and privileges therein. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, mostly the Omegas in the back, their faces bright with something that looked like hope. Others stood in shocked silence. And a few Celeste could see Lynn Donovan's face twisted with rage. Toby Maddox's expression, calculating and cold, looked like they'd just swallowed poison. Let any wolf who questions this union speak now, Roman continued. Or be bound by sacred law to accept the Alpha Queen's authority as equal to the king's own. Silence. Even Lynn was smart enough not to challenge a completed mate bond in front of the entire court. Roman smiled, sharp and satisfied. Then by my authority as witness to this union, I declare Celeste Anderson dead. Long live Queen Celeste Skinner, Alpha Queen of the Unified Territories. May her reign be long and her justice swift. The crowd took up the chant. Long live the Queen, long live the Queen. Nick's hand tightened on Celeste's waist, pulling her closer against his side. How does it feel? He murmured against her ear. To go from auction block to throne in 3 days? Terrifying, Celeste admitted. I don't know how to be a queen, Nick. I barely know how to survive court politics. Good thing you have a king willing to teach you. Nick turned her to face him, his expression serious despite the celebration happening below. But understand this, Celeste. The moment you accepted my claim, you painted a target on your back bigger than anything you faced at dinner. Every wolf who resents my rule will see you as the weak point, the vulnerability they can exploit. Then I'll have to prove I'm not weak, Celeste said, more confidently than she felt. Nick's smile was proud and dangerous. That's my queen. He kissed her forehead, then gestured to the crowd below. Come, we have a court to address. And you have your first royal decree to make. The throne room was even more intimidating than the dining hall. Massive and austere, all black marble and silver accents, with 2 thrones at the far end, one larger, clearly Nick's, and one beside it that had sat empty for as long as anyone could remember. Nick had never taken a queen, never shown interest in sharing power with anyone, until now. Celeste tried not to stumble in the formal gown Diane had dressed her in that morning, deep midnight blue with silver embroidery that caught the light like stars. The crown on her head felt impossibly heavy, a circlet of silver and moonstones that matched the ring Nick had given her. Her hand was tucked into the crook of Nick's arm as they processed down the center aisle, every eye in the packed room tracking their movement. She could feel the judgment, the speculation, the wolves wondering if she'd last a week as queen, or if Nick would tire of her just like he'd tired of every other Omega who'd briefly caught his attention. But Celeste lifted her chin, kept her spine straight, and met their stares with the same defiance she'd shown Lynn Donovan. She'd survived 3 nights of hell. She could survive this. Nick settled onto his throne with practiced ease. Then he gestured to the empty seat beside him, her seat now. Celeste sat, trying to look like she belonged there, like she hadn't spent most of her life invisible and overlooked. The assembled court knelt. Hundreds of wolves, all bending the knee to their king and goddess help her their new queen. Rise, Nick commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. The court rose as one. You've all heard the announcement. Queen Celeste is my fated mate, chosen by the moon goddess, and claimed by sacred law. Her word is my word. Her authority is my authority. Any wolf who disrespects her disrespects the crown itself. His gaze swept the room, promising violence to anyone foolish enough to test that decree. Now, my queen has requested the honor of her first royal proclamation. I suggest you all listen carefully. Every eye turned to Celeste. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical thing pressing down on her shoulders, testing whether she'd crack under the pressure. This was it, her first moment as queen. The first test of whether she could actually make a difference or if she'd just become another ornament decorating Nick's throne. Celeste stood. The crowd held its breath. "I come from Silverpine Pack," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "My father was Beta Harold Walls. Some of you knew him. Some of you fought against him when His Majesty unified the territories." She paused. Let that sink in. "I watched him burn rather than surrender. And for years, I hated the Alpha King for that. Hated him for destroying my home, enslaving my people, turning our world into something I barely recognized." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Nick remained perfectly still, but Celeste could feel his attention focused on her like a laser. "But in the past 3 days, I've learned something," she continued. "The old world we lost? It wasn't paradise. It was a beautiful lie built on the suffering of wolves like me. Omegas who were property long before His Majesty made it official, who were beaten, raped, sold, and driven to death by a system that claimed to be honorable while treating half its population as disposable." She thought of Natasha. Of the young Omega who jumped from a tower because honor and tradition had valued alliance over her life. His Majesty broke that system, burned it to ash. And yes, he built something harsh and cold in its place, something that still treats Omegas as property. Celeste's eyes found Nick's. "But at least now the cruelty is honest. At least now we know exactly where we stand." She turned back to the court. "That changes today. Here is my first decree, as your Alpha Queen. Effective immediately. Any Omega bearing the crown's mark is under my direct protection. Any Alpha or Beta who harms them without royal permission will answer to me personally. Any Omega who wishes to appeal their placement may petition my court directly, and any wolf, regardless of designation, who demonstrates exceptional service to the crown may request consideration for manumission." The crowd erupted in shocked whispers. Nick's expression revealed nothing, but Celeste felt surprise and something like pride flowing through their bond. "Furthermore," she continued, raising her voice over the noise, "I am establishing a Queen's Council, a body of Omegas selected from various territories to advise on matters affecting their designation. They will meet monthly and report directly to me. Their recommendations will carry weight in all policy decisions. Your Majesty." Lynn Donovan's voice cut through the whispers like a blade. She stood from where she'd been sitting with the other high-ranking alphas, her expression carefully neutral. "With respect, giving Omegas that kind of voice could destabilize the hierarchy His Majesty worked so hard to establish. It sends a message that this crown values all its wolves." Celeste interrupted, her voice sharp. "Not just the strong. Not just the dominant. All of them." She met Lynn's gaze directly. "Unless you're suggesting the Alpha King made a mistake binding himself to an Omega? That the moon goddess herself erred when she chose me as his equal?" Lynn's jaw clenched. She couldn't argue with that without questioning the divine order itself, and no wolf, no matter how powerful, would risk that kind of sacrilege. "Of course not, Your Majesty," Lynn forced out through gritted teeth. "I simply worry about implementation. Change can be dangerous. So can stagnation," Celeste countered. "And I'd rather face the danger of progress than the safety of continued suffering." She looked to Nick. "Unless His Majesty objects to my decree?" This was the moment. The test of whether Nick had meant what he said in that underwater chamber. Whether he'd truly listen when she told him he was wrong, or if his promise had been just another beautiful lie. Nick stood slowly, every movement deliberate and powerful. The entire court held its breath. "My queen has spoken," he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Her decree stands. Any wolf who challenges it challenges me." His smile was cold enough to freeze blood. "And we all know how I handle challenges to my authority." The message was clear. Celeste's decrees carried the full weight of Nick's power. Opposing her meant opposing him. "The Queen's Council will convene for the first time next week," Nick continued. "Roman, you'll coordinate the selection of representatives. Make sure every territory has a voice." He turned to Celeste, something complicated moving behind his eyes: pride, surprise, and maybe a hint of fear at what he'd just unleashed. "Is there anything else?" my queen. Celeste thought of all the Omegas in chains. Thought of Priscilla, still enslaved somewhere in these territories. Thought of every wolf like her who'd been invisible, overlooked, treated as less than nothing. One more thing, she said quietly. I want a full accounting of every Omega currently held as crown property. Names, locations, current placements, and I want the authority to review cases individually and reassign wolves who've been placed in dangerous situations. The court exploded into chaos. Alphas shouting objections, Omegas gasping in shock, everyone talking over each other until Nick's voice cut through the noise like thunder. Silence. The room went deathly quiet. The Queen's request is granted, Nick said flatly. Roman, make it happen. Full accounting within 3 days. He looked around the room, his expression promising violence to anyone who dared argue further. This court is adjourned, everyone out, now. The wolves filed out quickly, some shooting Celeste looks of resentment, others mostly Omegas looking at her like she'd just promised them salvation. When the throne room finally emptied, leaving just Celeste and Nick alone in that massive space, the silence felt deafening. Nick turned to her slowly. Celeste braced herself for anger, for punishment, for him to take back everything he'd promised in the heat of their bonding. Instead, he laughed. Goddess above, he said, pulling her against him. I give you a crown, and within an hour you're dismantling my entire system. Roman was right, you are going to be trouble. Are you angry? Celeste asked carefully. Angry? Nick tilted her chin up, his eyes bright with something she'd never seen in them before, genuine amusement mixed with admiration. I'm terrified. You just gained the loyalty of every Omega in the territories while making enemies of half my Alpha commanders. You've started a social revolution before you've even been queen for a day. He kissed her, hard and possessive. And I've never been more certain that the moon goddess knew exactly what she was doing when she bound us together. Relief flooded through Celeste. So you'll support the changes? I'll support you, Nick corrected. Even when you make decisions I disagree with. Even when your compassion threatens the order I've built. Because that's what I promised, to listen, to try, to build something better with you. His expression turned serious. But understand this, Celeste. The changes you're pushing for will create instability. Wolves who benefited from the old order will fight back. And they'll come for you first because they see you as the weak link. Then I'll have to prove them wrong, Celeste said. Yes, Nick agreed. You will. And I'll be right beside you when they come. But there's something you need to see first. Something that will help you understand exactly what we're up against. Nick led her deep into the Citadel's lower levels, past guards who saluted sharply as they passed, through corridors that grew progressively darker and colder. Finally, they reached a heavy iron door sealed with locks that required both their blood to open, linked to the mate bond, Celeste realized. Beyond the door was a chamber filled with filing cabinets and record books stretching from floor to ceiling. The accounting you requested, Nick said quietly. Every Omega claimed as crown property since I took the throne. 8 years of records. Thousands of wolves. He pulled out a ledger at random, opened it to a page marked with red ink. This is what you're really asking to review. Every name. Every placement. Every wolf whose life I've controlled. Celeste looked at the endless rows of cabinets and felt her stomach drop. Thousands. She'd known intellectually that Nick had enslaved countless Omegas, but seeing the physical evidence, seeing exactly how many lives had been catalogued and controlled, made it real in a way that statistics never could. Why are you showing me this? She asked. Because you need to understand the scope of what you're trying to change. Nick pulled out another ledger, this one marked with different colored tabs. Green tabs mean the Omega is in a stable placement, household servant, craftsperson, something relatively safe. Yellow means questionable, placed with an Alpha, who has a history of complaints, but nothing provable. Red means dangerous. He flipped through pages, and Celeste saw far too many red tabs. And black. He opened to a page marked in black. The entry had been crossed out with a single line. Black means dead, Nick said flatly. Sometimes from natural causes, sometimes from accidents, and sometimes, he closed the book. Sometimes from Alphas who forgot that crown property still belongs to the crown, and must be treated accordingly. Celeste felt bile rise in her throat. How many black tabs? Too many. Nick's expression was carved from stone. I've executed 17 alphas for killing crown property without permission. Made examples of them. But it still happens. Because at the end of the day, they're still slaves, still property, still seen as disposable by wolves who believe strength is the only thing that matters. He pulled Celeste close, his arms wrapping around her from behind as they stood, surrounded by 8 years of systematic enslavement documented in neat, careful handwriting. This is what you're fighting against, he murmured against her hair. Not just me. Not just a few cruel alphas. An entire worldview. A belief system so deeply ingrained that even enslaving thousands of wolves was seen as an improvement over what came before. His grip tightened. And you want to dismantle it with council meetings and individual case reviews, and hope that somehow, compassion will win out over centuries of tradition. Do you think I can't do it? Celeste asked quietly. I think you're the only wolf brave enough, or foolish enough to try. Nick turned her in his arms, his expression intense. But I also think you need to be realistic about what you're facing. Real change takes time. Years. Maybe decades. And in the meantime, wolves will suffer. Wolves will die. And you'll have to live with the knowledge that you couldn't save them all. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. Not cruel. Not manipulative. Just true. Celeste looked around the chamber at the thousands of names documented in those ledgers, at the systematic record-keeping of a regime built on the backs of wolves like her. She thought about her first decree, about the changes she wanted to make, about the impossibly large task she'd just claimed for herself. Then she thought about Natasha, about an Omega who died because no one had fought for her, because the system was too big, too entrenched, too powerful to challenge. I may not be able to save them all, Celeste said slowly, but I can save some. And some is better than none. Some is better than standing by and doing nothing while the ledgers keep filling up with black tabs. She met Nick's eyes. You said you wanted me to be your conscience. To remind you, there's more to leadership than fear and power. This is me doing that. This is me telling you that even if change takes decades, even if I can only help a handful of wolves, it's still worth trying. For a long moment, Nick just looked at her. Then he smiled, small and sad and genuine. You're going to break my heart, little queen, he murmured. But I suppose that's fair. I broke your world. Now you get to break me. He kissed her forehead. Fine. We'll start with your individual case reviews. But we do it smart. We prioritize the red and black tab placements first, the Omegas in immediate danger. Then we work backward through yellow. Green can wait. And the Queen's Council happens as scheduled. But Celeste's expression turned serious. The moment you start visibly protecting Omegas, the moment you give them hope and voice and power, you make yourself a target. Every alpha who resents the changes will see you as the enemy. And unlike me, you don't have 8 years of reputation as an unstoppable monster to protect you. So I'll build my own reputation, Celeste said, with more confidence than she felt. As the queen who actually gives a damn about all her subjects. Not just the strong ones. Nick laughed and pulled her close. Magnificent and terrifying. I really did luck out with this mate bond. He kissed her deeply, the bond flaring between them with heat and need. Come on. We have work to do. Starting with finding your sister. Celeste's heart stuttered. Priscilla? You think I didn't notice you scanning every Omega face at dinner looking for her? Nick pulled out one of the ledgers, flipped through pages with practiced efficiency, and stopped at an entry marked with a yellow tab. Priscilla Hendricks, claimed 3 months ago. Currently placed with Beta Greg Donnelly in the Southern Territories. No formal complaints filed, but... He frowned. Donnelly's been on my watch list. Nothing provable but rumors of rough treatment. Fear and fury warred in Celeste's chest. I want her brought here, reassigned to the palace. Done. Nick made a note in the margin. I'll send guards tomorrow to retrieve her. Donnelly won't object. He wouldn't dare refuse a direct order from the Alpha Queen. He looked at Celeste. But this is what I mean about making enemies. Donnelly will see this as interference, as you flexing power you haven't earned. And he'll find ways to push back. Let him try, Celeste said fiercely. Priscilla is my sister. If he's hurting her, then he'll answer to both of us, Nick finished. And I promise you, whatever punishment you devise, won't be as harsh as what I'll do if he's truly harmed someone under my crown's protection." His smile turned predatory. "See? We're already working together. You provide the compassion. I provide the terrifying threat of violence. Perfect partnership." Despite everything, the overwhelming task ahead, the enemies she'd just made, the thousands of names in those ledgers, Celeste found herself laughing. "Perfect partnership," she agreed, "though I reserve the right to occasionally be the terrifying one too." "Please do," Nick said. "Watching you eviscerate Lynn Donovan with words alone was one of the highlights of my reign." He offered his arm. "Now come. We have a kingdom to reform, a sister to rescue, and approximately 100 alphas who need to be reminded why defying the Alpha Queen is a spectacularly bad idea." As they left the record chamber and climbed back toward the light, Celeste felt the weight of that crown on her head settling into something more comfortable, more right. She'd survived 3 nights of hell to get here. She'd earned this throne through blood and tears and sheer stubborn will, and now she was going to use it to tear down the world Nick had built and create something better from the rubble. Even if it took her entire lifetime, even if it made enemies of every powerful wolf in the territories, even if the only ally she had was the monster-turned-mate walking beside her. His hand warm in hers, his soul bound to hers by the moon goddess's twisted sense of humor. They'd break the world together, and maybe, just maybe, they'd learn how to heal it too. Chapter 7. The Sisters Return. 3 days later, Priscilla arrived at the Citadel. Celeste stood in the receiving hall, her hands clenched so tightly her nails drew blood. Nick was beside her, a solid presence that had become her anchor in the chaos of her new life as queen. In just 72 hours, she'd reviewed hundreds of case files, established the framework for the Queen's Council, and made enemies of at least a dozen high-ranking alphas who resented her interference in their omegas. But none of that mattered right now. All that mattered was the guards approaching through the massive doors, a familiar figure walking between them. Priscilla looked nothing like the beautiful, golden girl Celeste remembered. Her sister had always been radiant, the kind of omega who turned heads when she walked into a room, with cascading blonde hair and blue eyes that sparkled with mischief. The wolf walking towards Celeste now was a shadow of that girl. Her hair was dull and matted, her skin pale and stretched too thin over visible bones. But it was her eyes that broke Celeste's heart, empty and dead, like someone had reached inside and extinguished every spark of life. "Priscilla," Celeste whispered, starting forward. Priscilla's gaze locked onto her, and for one heartbeat, there was nothing. No recognition, no emotion, just that terrible emptiness. Then something shifted. "Celeste?" Her voice was hoarse, uncertain, like she didn't trust what she was seeing. "Is that really you?" Celeste closed the distance between them and pulled her sister into a fierce embrace. Priscilla felt fragile in her arms, all sharp angles and trembling limbs. She smelled wrong too, like fear and pain layered over Beta Donnelly's aggressive territorial scent. "I'm here," Celeste murmured into her sister's hair. "I've got you. You're safe now." Priscilla pulled back, her eyes searching Celeste's face with growing confusion. "What are you doing here? How are you?" Her gaze landed on the crown Celeste wore, the expensive gown, the way Nick stood just behind her like a protective shadow. "I don't understand. Let's get you cleaned up first," Celeste said gently. "Fed. Rested. Then we'll talk. I promise I'll explain everything." She nodded to Diane, who'd been waiting nearby with Cherie. "Take her to the guest quarters in my wing. Draw a bath. Bring food. And find the palace physician. I want her examined. Thoroughly." "Your wing?" Priscilla's voice cracked. "Celeste, what's happening? They said the Alpha Queen summoned me, but I didn't know. I never thought." She looked between Celeste and Nick, and suddenly the crown made terrible sense. "Oh, goddess. You're her. You're the new queen everyone's talking about." "I am," Celeste confirmed. "And you're my sister. Which means you're under the crown's direct protection now. No one will hurt you again. I promise." Priscilla's legs gave out. Diane caught her before she hit the floor, supporting her weight with surprising strength. "Come on, dear. Let's get you somewhere safe. You can process all of this after you've eaten and slept." As Diane and Cherie led Priscilla away, her sister looking back over her shoulder with wide, disbelieving eyes, Celeste felt Nick's hand settle on her lower back. She's been badly treated, he said quietly. I can smell the fear on her. The trauma. Donnelly did more than rough handling. I know. Celeste's voice was ice. And he's going to answer for it. Good. Nick's smile was sharp. I was hoping you'd say that. Because Beta Greg Donnelly is waiting in the small council chamber. I had him summoned the moment the guards left to retrieve your sister. He turned her to face him. This is your first real test as Queen, Celeste. Not a formal dinner or a decree from the throne. This is direct confrontation with a beta who thinks he's untouchable because he commands the Southern Guard units. How you handle him will send a message to every other alpha and beta in the territories about what kind of queen you're going to be. Celeste's heart hammered. What would you do? In my position, I'd probably rip his throat out and leave his body in the courtyard as a warning. Nick's expression was matter of fact. But you're not me. You're better than me. So you'll find a way that doesn't involve quite as much bloodshed. He paused. Probably. Despite the fury burning in her chest, Celeste almost smiled. Come with me. I'm going to need you there to stop me from actually ripping his throat out. Or to hold him down while you do it, Nick offered. I'm flexible. Beta Greg Donnelly was exactly what Celeste expected, middle-aged, solidly built, with the kind of confidence that came from years of unchallenged authority. He stood when they entered the council chamber, his expression carefully neutral, but Celeste could see the resentment simmering beneath the surface. Your Majesty, Your Majesty. He nodded to Nick first, then to Celeste, a subtle slight that said he still saw her as secondary, despite her crown. I came as quickly as your guards requested. Demanded. Nick corrected, settling into a chair at the head of the table. My guards don't request. They deliver royal commands. He gestured for Celeste to take the seat beside him. My queen has questions about your treatment of the Omega Priscilla Hendricks. I suggest you answer honestly. Donnelly's jaw tightened. With respect, Your Majesty, the Omega was assigned to my household 3 months ago. She's been fed, clothed, and housed appropriately. I've filed no complaints and received no complaints about her placement. No complaints because she was too terrified to file one, Celeste said, her voice deadly calm. I want the truth, Beta Donnelly. What did you do to my sister? Something flickered in Donnelly's eyes, surprised that Celeste knew Priscilla was her sister, quickly masked. Your sister? Your Majesty? I didn't realize. Don't. Celeste stood, her hands flat on the table, leaning forward with intensity that surprised even her. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you treated her well. I saw her. Saw what 3 months in your household did to her. So I'll ask you one more time, and I suggest you remember that lying to the Alpha Queen is treason. Her voice dropped to something cold and dangerous. What did you do? Donnelly glanced at Nick, clearly hoping for intervention. Nick just smiled, cold and encouraging. Answer my queen's question, Beta. I'm very curious to hear your explanation as well. The Beta's confidence cracked. She was difficult, disobedient. She refused to follow orders, talked back, tried to run twice. I had to discipline her. For her own good, to teach her proper behavior. Discipline, Celeste repeated flatly. Define discipline. Restricted meals when she misbehaved. Confinement to her quarters. Standard correction methods for unruly Omegas. Did you hit her? Celeste's voice was ice. Donnelly hesitated just a fraction too long. Occasionally, when verbal correction proved insufficient, but nothing that left permanent marks, nothing that violated the king's regulations about crown property. Get out. Celeste's words cracked like a whip across the chamber. Donnelly blinked. I'm sorry? Get out. Celeste straightened to her full height, feeling power flow through the mate bond from Nick Alpha authority that made her voice carry weight beyond her Omega designation. You have 1 hour to gather your personal belongings and leave the Citadel. Your command of the Southern Guard units is hereby revoked. Your lands and titles are forfeit to the Crown, and you are banned from holding any position of authority over Omegas for the rest of your miserable life. The Beta's face went white. Your Majesty, you can't. I've served the Crown loyally for years. You beat my sister, Celeste said, each word sharp enough to cut. Starved her. broke her spirit so thoroughly she doesn't even recognize herself anymore. And you dare stand in my council chamber and call that loyal service? She leaned forward again, her eyes promising violence. The only reason you're walking out of here instead of being dragged out in chains is because I'm giving you the mercy you never showed Priscilla. 1 hour. Then my guards will hunt you down and throw you in the dungeons for treason against the crown. His Majesty will overturn this, Donnelly said desperately, turning to Nick. You can't let her strip me of everything because of one difficult omega. The temperature in the room dropped. Nick stood slowly, his expression turning into something that belonged on a predator, not a man. You just made 2 critical mistakes, Beta. First, you questioned my queen's authority. Second, you referred to her sister, a wolf under direct crown protection, as one difficult omega. He crossed the room with lethal grace, stopping inches from Donnelly. So let me be very clear. My queen's word is law. Her decrees stand unless I explicitly overturn them. And I will never ever overturn a ruling that protects omegas from wolves like you. His hand shot out, grabbing Donnelly by the throat and slamming him against the wall hard enough to crack stone. You have 30 minutes now, and if I ever hear you've laid hands on another Omega Crown property or not, I won't bother with trials or dungeons. I'll hunt you down personally and make you wish you'd died here today. Understood? Donnelly managed a strangled nod. Nick released him and stepped back, his expression returning to cold neutrality. Your time starts now. The Beta fled, nearly tripping over himself in his haste to escape. When the door slammed shut behind him, Celeste's legs finally gave out. She sank into her chair, her whole body shaking with reaction. She'd just stripped a high-ranking Beta of everything: his command, his lands, his authority. She'd made an enemy who would never forgive the humiliation, and she'd done it without hesitation, driven by pure fury at what Donnelly had done to Priscilla. Nick was beside her in an instant, pulling her against his chest. Breathe, little queen. You did well. I just destroyed a man's life. Celeste whispered against his shirt. You held a man accountable for his cruelty. Nick corrected. There's a difference. And you did it with more restraint than I would have shown. He pulled back enough to look at her face. How do you feel? Celeste took inventory of her emotions. She expected guilt, remorse. Instead, she felt powerful, like she'd finally wielded the authority that Crown represented for something that mattered. Good, she admitted. Is that wrong? Should I feel bad about ruining him? You feel satisfied because justice was served, Nick said. That's not wrong. That's human. Or wolf. In our case. He kissed her forehead. But understand, this is just the beginning. Word of what you did to Donnelly will spread. Every Beta and Alpha in the territories will hear how the new queen stripped a commander of his position over an Omega's treatment. Some will respect you for it. Others will see it as overreach. And a few, his expression darkened. A few will test you. Push boundaries to see if you'll enforce your decrees or if this was just a one-time show of force because Priscilla is your sister. Then I'll enforce them, Celeste said firmly. Every single time, until they learn that I mean what I say. Nick's smile was proud and dangerous. That's my queen. He pulled her to her feet. Come on. Your sister needs you, and you need to see if the physician found evidence of everything Donnelly did, because if he hurt her worse than he admitted, his eyes went cold. 30 minutes might not be enough time for him to get far enough away. The physician's report was damning. Dr. John Daniels was a grizzled older wolf who'd served as palace physician for over 20 years. He met Celeste and Nick in a small medical office adjacent to the guest quarters, his expression grim. Multiple healed fractures, he said without preamble, pulling out his notes. Left wrist, 2 ribs, collarbone, all consistent with defensive injuries. She was raising her hands to protect herself when struck. Significant scarring on her back from what appears to be a belt or similar implement. Evidence of prolonged malnutrition. And, he hesitated, glancing at Celeste. There are signs of sexual trauma, recent, within the last month. The world tilted. Celeste heard a sound escape her throat, something between a sob and a growl. Nick's hand found hers, gripping tight enough to hurt, anchoring her to reality when all she wanted to do was hunt Donnelly down and tear him apart with her bare hands. Can you prove it was Donnelly? Nick asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the rage Celeste could feel pouring through their bond. The injuries are consistent with the time frame of her placement in his household, Dr. Daniels said. And she confirmed it when I asked directly. Told me he forced himself on her 3 weeks ago. Said he claimed it was his right as her master, that Crown property existed to serve in whatever capacity their owners demanded. That is not Crown law, Nick said, each word sharp as broken glass. Sexual use of Crown property requires explicit permission from the throne. Donnelly knew that. He violated not just Priscilla, but royal decree, which makes it treason, Celeste said softly, the pieces clicking into place. He didn't just hurt my sister. He committed treason against the Crown. Against you. Nick's expression went predatory. Dr. Daniels. I need that report in writing. Every detail. Medical evidence that will hold up in a formal tribunal. He pulled out his communication device, typed rapidly. Roman, send guards to intercept Beta Donnelly before he leaves Citadel grounds. Charge, treason against the Crown through unauthorized sexual assault of Crown property. Bring him to the dungeons. I want him in chains within the hour. He looked at Celeste, and she saw the monster in his eyes, the Alpha King who'd conquered the territories through blood and terror. He's not walking away from this, Celeste. Not after what he did to your sister. To my subject. I'm going to make an example that will echo through every territory in this realm. What kind of example? Celeste asked quietly. The kind that ensures no Beta or Alpha ever again mistakes my reforms for weakness. The kind that makes it crystal clear that Crown property may be slaves, but they're my slaves, and I protect what's mine. His hand cupped her cheek. But you're the one he truly wronged. So you get to decide his fate. Execution, public humiliation, imprisonment, your choice, my queen. I'll enforce whatever judgment you decree. Celeste thought of Priscilla broken and hollow, used and discarded like she was nothing. Thought of all the other Omegas who'd suffered similar treatment because wolves like Donnelly believed they were untouchable. Thought of the message she needed to send if her reforms were going to mean anything at all. Public trial, she said finally. I want every Alpha, Beta, and Omega in the Citadel to hear the charges against him. I want the physician's testimony. I want Priscilla's testimony if she's strong enough to give it. And then I want him executed in the courtyard, where everyone can see exactly what happens to wolves who violate Crown law. Nick's smile was sharp and approving. Brutal and effective. I knew there was a reason the moon goddess bound us together. He pressed a kiss to her temple. The trial will be tomorrow at noon. That gives Priscilla time to rest, and Dr. Daniels time to prepare his evidence. And it gives every wolf in the Citadel time to gather and witness what happens when someone crosses the Alpha Queen. I want to see her, Celeste said. Priscilla. Before all of this starts. I need to know she understands she's safe now. She's in the guest quarters, Dr. Daniels said. Diane and Cherie have been with her. She's eaten, bathed, and I've given her something to help her sleep. But she's been asking for you. Celeste squeezed Nick's hand once, then released it and headed for the door. Thank you, Doctor, for taking care of her, for documenting everything, for her voice caught, for treating her like she mattered. Dr. Daniels's expression softened. Every patient matters, Your Majesty. It's one of the first things I learned in medical school, though I'll admit, it's refreshing to serve a queen who remembers that Omegas are patients too, not just property to be catalogued and treated as efficiently as possible. Priscilla was curled up in the enormous bed in the guest quarters, wearing a soft nightgown that was probably 3 sizes too big for her emaciated frame. Diane sat in a chair nearby, doing needlework, while Cherie organized medical supplies on a nearby table. Both looked up when Celeste entered, relief clear on their faces. She's been asking for you every few minutes, Diane said quietly. Won't sleep until she sees you're real. That this isn't just a dream she's going to wake up from. Celeste crossed to the bed and sat on its edge. Priscilla's eyes opened immediately, those blue eyes that used to sparkle with life, now haunted and wary. Hey, Celeste said softly. It's really me. I'm really here. How? Priscilla's voice was barely a whisper. Last time I saw you, we were being separated at the pack house burning. The soldiers took me one direction, dragged you another. I thought, her voice broke, I thought they'd killed you, thought I'd never see you again. They tried to sell me at auction, Celeste explained gently. That's where I met Nick. The Alpha King. He's my fated mate. Priscilla. The moon goddess bound us together. And through a series of events I'll explain when you're stronger, I became his queen, his equal, with the power to protect the people I love. Priscilla stared at her like she'd grown a second head. You're the Alpha King's fated mate. The monster who destroyed our pack. Who killed Father. Yes. Celeste didn't flinch from the truth. I know it sounds impossible. Insane. But the bond is real. And… She paused, searching for the right words. He's not just a monster, Priscilla. He's complicated, broken. He did terrible things for reasons I'm only beginning to understand. And we're both trying to build something better than what came before. Does he know? Priscilla asked quietly. About what Donnelly did to me. He knows everything. Dr. Daniels gave us his full report. Celeste took her sister's hand carefully, mindful of the healing fracture. There's going to be a trial tomorrow. Public. Everyone in the Citadel will hear what Donnelly did to you, and then… She met Priscilla's haunted eyes. Then he'll be executed for treason. For violating crown law. For hurting you. Priscilla's breath caught. You're going to kill him? For me? I'm going to make sure he can never hurt another Omega again, Celeste corrected. And yes, that means execution. If you're not comfortable with that, if you want a different punishment. No. Priscilla's voice was stronger than Celeste had heard it all day. I want him dead. I want every wolf like him to see what happens when they treat us like we're nothing. Like we're just bodies to use and discard. Her grip on Celeste's hand tightened. But Celeste, I have to tell you something. About Donnelly. About what he said before he… She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Celeste understood. Tell me, she said gently. Whatever it is, I need to know. Priscilla took a shaky breath. He said Father sold me to him. That before the conquest, before everything fell apart, Father had gambling debts. Bad ones. And he sold 17 Omegas from our pack, including me, to cover those debts. The only reason the sale never went through was because the king's forces arrived first and claimed all Omegas as crown property. The words hit Celeste like a physical blow. Roman had said the same thing. Nick had implied it. But hearing it from Priscilla, hearing confirmation that their father had literally sold his own daughter to pay gambling debts, made it real in a way nothing else could. I didn't want to believe it, Priscilla continued, tears streaming down her face. Wanted to think Donnelly was lying. But then I remembered. All those times Father met with strange alphas. All those whispered conversations about debts and arrangements. The way Mother got quieter and sadder, like she knew something terrible was coming. She looked at Celeste with eyes that had seen too much. Our father was a monster too, Celeste. Different from the Alpha King, maybe. But still a monster. Celeste pulled her sister into a careful embrace, mindful of healing ribs and too thin bones. They stayed like that for a long moment. Two Omega sisters mourning the loss of a father they'd thought they knew. Grieving the beautiful lie their childhood had been built on. We can't change what Father did, Celeste said finally. Can't undo the harm he caused or save the Omegas he sold. But we can make sure the world he helped create doesn't continue. We can build something better. She pulled back to look at Priscilla. That's what I'm trying to do. With the crown. With my position as queen. I'm trying to protect Omegas. Give them voice and choice and the rights they should have had all along. And the Alpha King is letting you do this? Priscilla sounded disbelieving. The wolf who enslaved us all? He's supporting it, Celeste confirmed. Because we made a deal. Because the mate bond demands we try to understand each other even when we disagree. And because… She smiled sadly. Because I think he's as tired of being the monster as we are of being victims. He just doesn't know how to be anything else yet. Priscilla studied her sister's face. You love him. It wasn't a question. And Celeste couldn't deny it. Not when the bond hummed constantly beneath her skin. Not when every hour away from Nick felt like slow suffocation. Not when she found herself defending his actions even while working to change them. I do, she admitted. Which is insane and impossible and probably the result of bond-induced Stockholm syndrome. But yes, I love the monster who destroyed our world. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to remind him he's capable of being more than the terror he's made himself into. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, Priscilla said. Then incredibly, she smiled, small and broken, but real. Which means it's probably exactly what the moon goddess intended. She always did have a twisted sense of humor. Celeste laughed, surprised the sound could exist in the middle of so much pain. That's what everyone keeps saying. I'm starting to think the goddess is running some kind of cosmic social experiment to see what happens when you bind opposites together and tell them to fix a broken world. Well, if anyone can do it, it's you, Priscilla said, her eyes already drifting closed as the medication Dr. Daniels had given her took hold. You were always the strong one, Celeste. The one who survived when prettier, more perfect me couldn't figure out how to keep going. You're going to be an amazing queen. Going to change everything. Rest, Celeste murmured, tucking the blanket around her sister. Tomorrow we get justice, and then we start building that better world, together. Priscilla was asleep before Celeste finished speaking, her face finally relaxing into something approaching peace. Celeste sat beside her for a long moment, watching her sister breathe, making silent promises about all the ways she'd protect her from now on. Then she stood, nodded to Diane and Cherie to keep watch, and went to find her mate. Tomorrow, they'd execute a traitor. Tomorrow, they'd send a message to every wolf in the territories about what happened when you crossed the Alpha Queen. Tomorrow, the real work of changing the world would begin. But tonight, Celeste just needed to be held by the only wolf in existence who could understand the terrible weight of power. Mixed with purpose, the monster-turned mate, who'd given her a crown and then stood beside her as she figured out how to wield it. Chapter 8. The Trial of Beta Donnelly. The courtyard was packed. Every Alpha, Beta, and Omega in the Citadel had gathered for the trial, standing in concentric circles around a raised platform where Celeste and Nick sat on temporary thrones. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, making the crowd shift and murmur with uncomfortable anticipation. Guards lined the perimeter, hands on weapons, ready to intervene if anyone decided to challenge the proceedings. Beta Greg Donnelly knelt in chains at the base of the platform, flanked by two of Nick's most trusted soldiers. His face was bruised, the guards hadn't been gentle during his arrest, and his expensive clothes were torn and dirty. He looked nothing like the confident commander who'd stood in the council chamber yesterday, dismissing Priscilla's suffering as discipline. Now he looked like what he was: a criminal awaiting judgment. Roman Terry stood beside the platform, acting as prosecutor. He held a thick folder of evidence: Dr. Daniels' medical report, witness statements, documentation of every law Donnelly had violated. His expression was coldly professional, but Celeste could see the satisfaction in his eyes. Roman had never liked Donnelly, had warned Nick multiple times about giving him command positions. "This tribunal is called to order," Roman announced, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. Beta Greg Donnelly stands accused of multiple violations of Crown law. The charges are as follows: unauthorized sexual assault of Crown property, physical abuse resulting in serious injury, theft of Crown resources through misappropriation of food rations, and treason against the throne through willful violation of royal decree. A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. Treason was a capital offense, punishable by death without possibility of appeal. "How do you plead, Beta Donnelly?" Roman asked. Donnelly lifted his head, his eyes finding Celeste on her throne. "I plead not guilty, Your Majesty. These charges are fabricated." The Omega in question was difficult and prone to lies. Choose your next words very carefully," Nick interrupted, his voice like ice. "Because if you finish that sentence by accusing Priscilla Hendricks of lying, I'll have your tongue cut out before this trial even begins." Donnelly's jaw snapped shut. He looked to the crowd, searching for allies, for anyone who might support his defense. Most avoided his gaze. A few alphas who'd benefited from loose enforcement of Crown property regulations watched with calculating expressions. "The accused pleads not guilty," Roman said. "Very well. Let us present the evidence." He opened the folder. "Dr. John Daniels, Palace Physician, please approach." Dr. Daniels stepped onto the platform, his medical bag in hand. He'd brought visual aids, diagrams showing the extent of Priscilla's injuries, photographs that made several Omegas in the crowd gasp in horror. These injuries were documented 3 days ago when Priscilla Hendricks arrived at the Citadel, Dr. Daniels explained, holding up each image. Multiple healed fractures consistent with defensive wounds. Severe scarring from repeated beatings. Evidence of prolonged malnutrition. She was 50 pounds underweight when examined. And, he paused, his voice hardening. Physical evidence of forced sexual contact within the last month. The crowd erupted in whispers. Several omegas were crying. Even some of the harder alphas looked uncomfortable. Can you state with medical certainty that these injuries occurred during the 3 months Priscilla Hendricks spent in Beta Donnelly's household? Roman asked. I can, Dr. Daniels confirmed. The time frame of healing is consistent with her placement. And the victim confirmed under physician-patient confidentiality that Beta Donnelly was responsible for all documented injuries. Objection, Donnelly shouted, struggling against his chains. Physician-patient confidentiality means that testimony shouldn't be admissible. She could have said anything. Physician-patient confidentiality is waived in cases of suspected treason, Roman countered smoothly. As is clearly outlined in the legal code His Majesty established 6 years ago, a code you swore to uphold when you accepted command of the Southern Territories. He turned back to Dr. Daniels. Did the victim provide consent for you to share this information? She did, Dr. Daniels said. In writing, she wanted the truth known. Roman held up a document bearing Priscilla's signature. Let the record show that Priscilla Hendricks voluntarily waived confidentiality and requested her medical testimony be entered as evidence. He dismissed Dr. Daniels and called the next witness a servant from Donnelly's household. An older Omega named Owen Collins who'd served there for 2 years. Owen looked terrified, his eyes darting between Donnelly and the royal platform. Tell the court what you witnessed during Priscilla Hendricks's time in Beta Donnelly's household, Roman instructed gently. Owen's voice shook. I saw him hit her. Multiple times. With his fists, with a belt. She'd talk back or move too slowly, and he'd swallowed hard. He'd drag her to his private chambers and lock the door. We'd hear screaming, and when she came out she'd be bleeding, bruised, sometimes unconscious. Did you report this to authorities? Roman asked. How could I? Owen's voice cracked. I'm an Omega. Crown property. Who would listen? Who would care? He looked directly at Celeste, something like hope in his eyes. But you're listening now. The Queen is listening. And maybe that means things can finally change. Celeste felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not when the entire court was watching to see if she'd break under the weight of this testimony. Thank you, Owen, Roman said quietly. Your bravery in coming forward will not be forgotten. He turned to Donnelly. Do you wish to cross-examine this witness? He's lying, Donnelly spat. Every Omega in that household hated me because I maintained discipline. They're conspiring against me, probably at the Queen's instruction. Careful, Nick said softly. But the threat in his voice made several wolves in the front row step back. You're already facing execution. Don't add insulting my queen to your list of treasons. Donnelly wisely shut his mouth. Roman called 2 more witnesses, both servants from Donnelly's household, both with similar stories of abuse, cruelty, and violations of crown law. By the time the testimony finished, even the alphas who'd initially seemed sympathetic to Donnelly were avoiding his gaze. The prosecution rests, Roman announced, unless the accused wishes to present a defense. Donnelly looked around desperately. I demand trial by combat. As is my right as a beta of standing. Denied, Celeste said, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. She stood from her throne, and the entire courtyard fell silent. Trial by combat is reserved for challenges between equals. You are not my equal, Beta Donnelly. You are a criminal who violated every law designed to protect the weakest members of our society. You took a wolf under crown protection, my sister, and treated her like garbage, beat her, starved her, raped her. Her voice rose, carrying to every corner of the packed courtyard. You did this believing you were untouchable, believing that your position, your connections, your status as a beta would protect you from consequences, but you were wrong. She descended from the platform, walking toward Donnelly with measured steps. Nick remained seated, but she could feel his presence through the bond, ready to intervene if Donnelly tried anything but letting her handle this her way. I am the Alpha Queen, Celeste said, stopping directly in front of Donnelly's kneeling form. Chosen by the Moon Goddess. bound to the most powerful alpha in the territories. And I am telling every wolf in this courtyard, that the days of treating omegas as disposable property are over. Not because we're changing the law overnight, not because slavery is suddenly abolished, but because I will personally destroy anyone who mistakes my reforms for weakness. She crouched down, bringing herself eye level with Donnelly. You hurt my sister. You violated crown law. You committed treason. And now you will serve as an example to every other beta and alpha watching this trial and wondering if the new queen is serious about her decrees. She stood, turned to face the crowd. Beta Greg Donnelly, you are hereby found guilty of all charges. The sentence is death by beheading, to be carried out immediately. Your lands are forfeit to the crown. Your name will be stricken from all records of honor, and your body will be burned without ceremony, your ashes scattered to ensure you find no rest in the afterlife. The crowd was completely silent. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Does anyone wish to speak in this beta's defense? Celeste asked, her voice carrying challenge. Does anyone here believe he deserves mercy? No one moved, no one spoke, even Donnelly's closest allies remained frozen. Then let the sentence be carried out. Celeste looked to Nick. Unless His Majesty wishes to overrule my judgment. Nick stood, descended from the platform, and crossed to stand beside her. His hand found hers, their fingers lacing together a public display of unity that sent a clear message to everyone watching. My queen's judgment stands, Nick announced. And let it be known throughout the territories, this is what happens to wolves who violate crown law. This is what happens when you mistake reform for weakness. The Alpha Queen is not soft, she is not naive. She is justice personified, and she will burn anyone who threatens the wolves under her protection. He nodded to the guards. Executioner, proceed. A massive Alpha stepped forward. Cliff Monroe, the Citadel's official executioner, carrying an axe that looked like it could cleave a wolf in half. He was efficient and professional, his expression neutral as he positioned himself behind Donnelly's kneeling form. Any last words? Celeste asked, surprising herself with the offer. Donnelly lifted his head, and for the first time, genuine fear showed in his eyes. I was just following the old ways, the traditions we've always had. You can't kill me for doing what every alpha and beta has done for centuries. Yes, Celeste interrupted softly. I can. Because those old ways are dead. Because tradition built on suffering deserves to be burned. And because 3 days ago, I chose to stay with the wolf who conquered this realm and help him build something better from the ashes. She met Donnelly's eyes without flinching. Your death marks the beginning of that new world. May the moon goddess have mercy on your soul, because I have none to give. She nodded to Cliff. The axe fell. The sound echoed across the silent courtyard like thunder. Donnelly's head rolled, coming to rest several feet from his body. Blood pooled on the stone platform. Stark and red in the morning sunlight, several omegas in the crowd were crying not from sadness, but from relief. From the cathartic release of seeing justice served for once. From hope that maybe, just maybe, things really were changing. Celeste turned away from the body, her hand still locked with Nick's. Guards, dispose of the remains, as I specified. And someone find Owen Collins. I want him reassigned to palace duties under Diane's supervision. He'll never serve another cruel master again. She walked back to the platform, climbed the steps, and reclaimed her throne beside Nick's. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, to process what she'd just done. She'd ordered an execution, watched a wolf die on her command, and she didn't feel guilty or horrified or broken. She felt powerful, righteous, like she'd finally done something that mattered. How do you feel? Nick murmured through their bond, his voice concerned. Like a queen, Celeste replied honestly. Is that wrong? Should I feel worse about this? You feel like a queen because you are one, Nick said. And queens make hard choices. They dispense justice even when it requires bloodshed. They protect their people even when protection looks like violence. He squeezed her hand. You did what needed to be done. Own it. Don't apologize for it. Roman approached the platform, dismissing the crowd with a gesture. Wolves began filing out of the courtyard, some quickly, eager to escape the smell of blood, others lingering to stare at Celeste with new understanding. The Omega nobody wanted had just executed a beta commander in front of the entire court. The plain girl from Silverpine Pack had just proved she could wield power as brutally as any alpha. The Alpha Queen was not to be underestimated. That was well done, Roman said quietly, climbing the platform steps. Brutal, uncompromising, and exactly the message needed. Every alpha in this citadel now understands that your reforms come with teeth. That harming an Omega under crown protection means facing the Queen's justice, and the Queen's justice is swift and merciless. Will it be enough? Celeste asked. Or will they just be more careful about hiding their abuses? Some will hide better, Roman admitted. But others will stop entirely, because the risk is no longer worth the reward. And that's progress, Your Majesty. Not perfect, not complete, but progress nonetheless. He glanced at Nick. Though I imagine we'll have some political fallout. Donnelly had allies in the Southern Territories. They'll see this as an attack on their autonomy. Then they can bring their complaints to my queen directly, Nick said coldly. And she can explain why their autonomy doesn't include the right to torture wolves under crown protection. I'm sure that will be an enlightening conversation for everyone involved. A commotion near the courtyard entrance drew their attention. Diane was hurrying toward them, her expression urgent. Your Majesty, she addressed Celeste breathlessly. It's Priscilla, she's asking for you. She watched the execution from one of the tower windows, and Diane hesitated. She's not handling it well. She needs her sister. Celeste was moving before Diane finished speaking. Nick close behind her. They ran through corridors and upstairs, finally bursting into the guest quarters where Priscilla sat on the floor, her back against the bed, staring at nothing. Priscilla. Celeste dropped to her knees beside her sister. Talk to me. You killed him, Priscilla whispered. You actually killed him. For me. Yes, Celeste said simply. He hurt you. He deserved to die. But you're not, Priscilla's voice cracked. You were never violent, never cruel. You were the kind one, the gentle one, and I just watched you order an execution without flinching, without hesitation. She finally looked at Celeste, her eyes haunted. What did they do to you? What did he? She glanced at Nick. What did the Alpha King do to turn you into this? The question hit harder than any physical blow. Because Priscilla was right 3 days ago, Celeste would have been horrified by public execution, would have argued for mercy, for imprisonment, for anything other than death. But 3 nights of trials had changed her. The bond had changed her. Understanding the weight of power and responsibility had changed her. She wasn't the invisible Omega from Silverpine Pack anymore. She was Queen Celeste Skinner, and queens made hard choices. He gave me power, Celeste said quietly. And I chose how to use it. Donnelly's death isn't on Nick. It's on me. I made that call. I spoke that sentence. I watched the axe fall and felt satisfied that justice was served. She took Priscilla's hands. I know that scares you. I know you're looking at me and seeing a stranger. But I'm still your sister. Still the wolf who would do anything to protect you. I'm just a queen, Priscilla finished. You're a queen now, with all that entails. She looked between Celeste and Nick, something complicated crossing her face. I don't know if I should thank you for avenging me or fear what you're becoming. Both, Nick said, speaking for the first time. He knelt beside Celeste, his presence solid and grounding. Thank her for protecting you. Fear what she's capable of when pushed. Because that combination, compassion backed by ruthlessness, is what makes a truly powerful ruler. And your sister is going to be one of the most powerful queens this realm has ever seen. He stood, offered his hand to Celeste. Come on, little queen. We have a kingdom to run, and about 50 alphas who need to be reminded that today's execution wasn't a fluke. It's the new standard. Celeste squeezed Priscilla's hands once more. Rest. Process. Take all the time you need to figure out how you feel about what I've become. But know this, I would make the same choice again. Would order 100 executions if it meant protecting wolves like you. Like me. Like every Omega who's been invisible and overlooked and treated like they don't matter. She let Nick pull her to her feet, but paused at the door. You said I'm not the gentle one anymore. But Priscilla? I was never gentle. I was just invisible. And invisible wolves can't protect anyone. So I chose to be seen. Chose to be feared. chose to become exactly what this broken world needed: a queen who remembers what it's like to be powerless and refuses to let it happen to anyone else. Then she left, Nick's hand warm in hers, the crown heavy on her head, and the weight of one death, the first of many she'd order in the years to come, settling onto her shoulders like armor. She'd survived 3 nights to get here. She'd become a queen in the process. And now, standing in the aftermath of her first execution, with her monster-turned mate beside her, and an entire realm watching to see what she'd do next, Celeste Anderson knew. Queen Celeste Skinner felt something she'd never experienced before in her invisible, overlooked life. She felt unstoppable. Chapter 9. The Queen's Council. 1 week after Donnelly's execution, the first Queen's Council convened in a chamber that had sat unused for decades. Celeste had chosen it specifically for its symbolism: a circular room with windows overlooking the territories, no head of the table because no voice would be more important than another. 12 chairs arranged in a perfect circle, each one occupied by an Omega representative from different territories across the realm. They looked terrified. Celeste couldn't blame them. Most had never been in the Citadel before, let alone summoned to advise the throne. They sat rigidly in their chairs, eyes downcast, waiting for the trap they were certain this must be. Omegas didn't get voices, didn't get councils, didn't get to sit in rooms with the Alpha Queen and offer opinions on policy. Except now they did. "Thank you all for coming," Celeste began, standing at her place in the circle rather than sitting. She wanted to be on their level, not above them. "I know this is unprecedented. I know many of you are wondering if this is real or some elaborate test, so let me be clear from the start: this council is real. Your voices matter. And what we discuss in this room will directly influence Crown policy going forward." A woman near Celeste's left, Joe Shelton from the Western Territories, raised a trembling hand. "Your Majesty, forgive me, but why? Why give Omegas this kind of power? What do you gain from it?" "Perspective," Celeste answered honestly. "I've been queen for 7 days. In that time, I've reviewed hundreds of case files, reassigned dozens of Omegas from dangerous placements, and executed a beta who violated Crown law. But I'm one wolf. I can't see everything. Can't know every situation, can't be everywhere abuse might be happening." She gestured to the assembled Omegas. "You 12 represent different territories, different experiences, different insights into how Crown policies actually affect the wolves they're meant to protect. I need your eyes, your voices, your truth." "And if our truth contradicts what His Majesty wants to hear?" asked another woman, Ernesto Hendricks from the Northern Territories, older and clearly less intimidated than the others. "If we tell you that Crown policies are still harmful, still oppressive, still treating us like property, what happens then?" "Then I listen," Celeste said. "And I work with His Majesty to find solutions. I won't promise instant change. I won't promise that every recommendation will be implemented exactly as you suggest, but I will promise that your voices will be heard, that your experiences will matter. That for the first time since this regime began, Omegas will have direct input into the laws that govern their lives." She sat down, making herself equal to them in posture if not in rank. "So let's start. Tell me what's really happening in the territories. Tell me what I'm missing from my palace chambers. Tell me the truth that doesn't make it into official reports." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Joe Shelton cleared her throat. "The food rations are insufficient," she said quietly. "Crown property is supposed to receive adequate nutrition, but in the Western Territories, the local alphas are skimming supplies, selling them for profit. We're getting maybe 60% of what's allocated, and we're too afraid to complain because the last Omega who filed a formal complaint disappeared." Celeste's blood went cold. "Disappeared as in reassigned? Or disappeared as in, we don't know?" Joe admitted. "She just vanished one night. No record of transfer. No death certificate. Just gone." Celeste made a note on the tablet in front of her. "I'll investigate personally. Get me her name and the names of the alphas controlling ration distribution in the Western Territories. If they're stealing Crown resources and harming Crown property, they'll face the same justice Donnelly did." She saw several council members sit up straighter, hope flickering in their eyes. They'd expected platitudes. Instead they were getting action. "What else?" Celeste prompted. Another hand raised, Angelo Conklin from the Southern Territories. "The breeding protocols. They're worse than death," For some of us. His voice was tight. Crown property designated as fertile and suitable get assigned to breeding programs. Matched with alphas based on genetic compatibility. Forced to produce pups whether we want them or not. And if we refuse. He swallowed hard. They drug us. Force it anyway. Then take the pups away the moment they're weaned. Celeste felt Nick's presence through the bond before she saw him. He'd entered the room silently, standing in the doorway, watching the proceedings with unreadable eyes. She hadn't invited him. This was meant to be a space where Omegas could speak freely without the Alpha King's intimidating presence. But now that he was here, she realized they needed him to hear this. Needed him to understand exactly what his policies looked like from the bottom. Continue, she said to Angelo, keeping her voice steady, despite the rage building in her chest. Tell us everything about the breeding protocols. Angelo glanced nervously at Nick, but Celeste's encouraging nod gave him courage. There are 3 facilities, 1 in each major territory. They're called nurseries in official documents, but everyone knows they're breeding farms. Omegas are kept there for years, used until they're too old or too damaged to produce viable pups, then reassigned to manual labor positions until they die. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, his hands shaking. I have names. 37 Omegas currently in the southern facility alone. Some have been there for 5 years. 7 years. One has been there since His Majesty first established the program. 8 years of forced breeding. 8 years of having her body used and her children stolen. The room was deathly silent. Celeste could feel every pair of eyes on her, waiting to see how she'd respond. Waiting to see if this counsel was real or just another beautiful lie designed to give Omegas false hope before crushing them completely. She stood slowly, walked across the circle to Angelo, and took the paper from his trembling hands. Thank you, she said quietly, for bringing this to my attention, for being brave enough to speak truth in front of the Alpha King himself. She turned to face Nick, who stood frozen in the doorway, his expression carefully blank. We need to talk. Now. They didn't make it to a private chamber before the argument started. You knew. Celeste accused the moment they were in the corridor outside the council room. You knew about the breeding facilities. About forced impregnation. About Omegas being used as broodmares for years on end. And you never told me. Because I knew you'd react exactly like this. Nick shot back, his voice tight. With horror and moral outrage and demands to dismantle a program that serves a critical function. Critical function? Celeste's voice rose despite her best efforts to stay calm. Nick, they're rape farms. Systematic, institutionalized sexual slavery. How is that critical? Because the wolf population is declining. Nick's control finally cracked. Because 8 years of war devastated our numbers. Because entire packs were wiped out, and we need the next generation, or there won't be a realm left to rule. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration clear in every line of his body. You think I wanted this? You think I enjoyed creating those facilities? But it was either controlled breeding programs, or watch our species slowly die out. There have to be other options, Celeste insisted. Incentivize voluntary breeding. Offer bonuses to Omegas who choose to have pups. Create support systems that make parenting attractive, instead of forcing wolves into it against their will. And in the meantime? Nick challenged. While we're implementing your compassionate alternatives, what happens to the population decline? Do we just accept that the next generation will be too small to sustain pack structures? That within 50 years, there might not be enough wolves left to maintain territories? Celeste opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Because he had a point. As much as she hated admitting it, Nick had a point. The population issue was real. The breeding facilities, however horrific, were addressing a genuine crisis. How many? She asked quietly. How many Omegas total in these facilities? Nick's jaw clenched. 217. All designated as crown property, all legally acquired through conquest or auction. 217 wolves. Living in what amounted to institutionalized rape. Producing pups they'd never get to raise. Existing solely to repopulate a species nearly destroyed by the same Alpha King who now claimed their breeding was necessary. I want to visit them, Celeste said. The facilities. I want to see conditions with my own eyes, talk to the Omegas directly, And then I want full autonomy to reform the program in whatever way I see fit. Celeste, no. She cut him off, her voice hard. You promised to listen when I told you that you were wrong. You promised to build something better with me. Well, I'm telling you now, this is wrong. These facilities are wrong. And if we can't find a way to address population decline without systematic rape, then we don't deserve to survive as a species. Nick stared at her for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he smiled, small and sad and genuine. You're going to be the death of me, little queen, he murmured. But fine, we'll visit the facilities. You can talk to the Omegas, assess conditions, propose reforms. But Celeste, his expression turned serious. If you dismantle this program without a viable alternative in place, you'll create a crisis that could destabilize the entire realm. Population decline leads to territory disputes, which lead to war, which leads to more death. Be sure your compassion doesn't create more suffering than it prevents. It was the most honest he'd ever been with her about the brutal calculus of ruling. The impossible choices where every option caused harm, and you just had to pick the least terrible one. I understand, Celeste said quietly. And I'll be careful, but Nick, I can't be queen and ignore this. Can't sit in that council room and listen to Angelo describe 8 years of forced breeding and then just do nothing. If I become that kind of ruler, I'm no better than the system I'm trying to change. No, Nick agreed, pulling her close despite the fury still radiating between them. You'd be worse. Because you'd know better and choose cruelty anyway. He kissed her forehead. That's why I need you. Why the moon goddess bound us together. Because left to my own devices, I'd calculate the acceptable losses and move on. But you refuse to accept that any loss is acceptable. You fight for every single wolf, even when it's not practical, even when it's not possible. Is that why you're letting me do this? Celeste asked. Reform your regime from the inside? Because you know you've lost the ability to see the harm you're causing? Partly, Nick admitted. But also because watching you fight for Omegas with the same ferocity I fight for territory is the most attractive thing I've ever seen. You're magnificent when you're righteous, little mate. Even when your righteousness is directed at me. Despite everything, the argument, the breeding facilities, the impossible task ahead, Celeste found herself smiling. You're insane. Probably, Nick agreed. But I'm your insane monster mate. And you're stuck with me for eternity. So, let's go back to your council meeting. Let's hear what other horrors my regime has created. And then we'll figure out how to fix them without destroying everything in the process. The council meeting lasted another 3 hours. By the end, Celeste had filled 5 tablets with notes about problems she'd never known existed. Insufficient medical care for injured Omegas, sexual harassment that went unreported because filing complaints meant risking reassignment to worse positions, pups born to Omega mothers being automatically claimed as crown property, creating generations of wolves who'd never know their parents. Each revelation was worse than the last. Each one showed just how deeply systemic the oppression ran, how many ways the current system harmed the wolves it was supposed to protect. But mixed with the horror was something unexpected hope. The council members started hesitant and terrified, but by the end they were arguing with each other, proposing solutions, debating policy details. They were acting like their voices mattered, like they had power. Because for the first time in 8 years, they did. This has been productive, Celeste said as the meeting drew to a close. Painful and overwhelming, but productive. You've given me more actionable intelligence than months of official reports. So here's what happens next. She stood, and the entire council stood with her, not out of obligation, but respect. First, we're investigating the missing Omega in the Western Territories. If local alphas are stealing rations and covering up deaths, they'll face crown justice. Second, I'm visiting the breeding facilities personally. I'll talk to every Omega willing to speak with me, assess conditions, and develop reform proposals. Third, she looked around the circle. This council becomes permanent. We meet monthly. You bring me truth, I bring you updates on policy changes. Together, we push this realm towards something better than what it's been. And if the alphas resist? Joe Shelton asked. If they see this council as a threat to their authority, then they can bring their concerns to me directly, Celeste replied. And I'll explain why their authority doesn't extend to systematic oppression. She smiled, sharp and dangerous. You all saw what happened to Beta Donnelly. That wasn't an isolated incident. That was a promise. Any wolf who harms crown property without justification will face the Alpha Queen's justice. And my justice is neither quick nor merciful. She saw several council members smile small, fierce expressions that said they were starting to believe this might actually be real. One more thing, Ernesto Hendricks said. Your Majesty, the Omegas in the territories are talking. Word is spreading about the council, about Donnelly's execution, about you standing up for wolves like us. But there's also pushback. Alphas who resent the changes, who are punishing their crown property for your reforms, taking out their frustration on wolves who have no way to defend themselves. Celeste's heart sank. She'd expected resistance from high-ranking wolves. She hadn't considered that her reforms might create backlash that hurt the very Omegas she was trying to protect. Document every incident, she said firmly. Names, locations, specific abuses. I want evidence I can use to prosecute. And tell the Omegas in the territories, tell them to hold on. Tell them the Queen sees them. That help is coming. It might take time. It might not be fast enough. But it's coming. They'll need more than words, Ernesto said gently. They'll need proof that resistance is worth the risk. Then we'll give them proof. Celeste looked to Nick, who'd remained silent throughout the meeting, just observing. His Majesty and I will visit the territories personally. Show wolves that the King and Queen stand united on these reforms. Make it clear that harming crown property in retaliation isn't just defying me, it's defying him too. Nick nodded, his expression approving. Territory tour. Starts next week. We'll hit all 3 major regions, meet with local alphas, inspect crown property placements. Any wolf found in violation of protection decrees will face immediate consequences. He stepped forward, his presence filling the room. And let me be clear to everyone in this council, my Queen's reforms have my full support. I may not agree with every decision, may not love every policy change. But I gave her power to use as she sees fit, and I stand behind that choice. So when you go back to your territories and spread word of this meeting, make sure you include that part. The Alpha King and Alpha Queen are united. And united, we're unstoppable. The council members looked between Celeste and Nick with growing understanding. This wasn't just political theater. The bond between them was real, and it translated into genuine partnership even when they disagreed, even when it required compromise. They were building something together. Thank you all for your bravery today, Celeste said, as the meeting officially concluded. For speaking truth when it would have been safer to stay silent. For trusting that this council could be real. You've given me the tools to start meaningful change, and I won't waste that gift. As the council members filed out, still nervous, but walking taller than when they'd arrived, Roman appeared in the doorway. Productive meeting? He asked dryly. Devastating meeting, Celeste corrected. I just learned that literally every aspect of Crown policy toward Omegas is more horrific than I imagined. Breeding facilities, stolen rations, missing wolves, retaliatory abuse. She sank into one of the chairs, suddenly exhausted. How do I fix this, Roman? How do I reform a system this broken without causing more harm? Roman pulled up a chair beside her. The same way you eat an entire feast, one bite at a time. You can't solve everything at once, but you can prioritize. Breeding facilities first. Because that's the most egregious violation. Then the ration theft. Because that's actively killing wolves. Then work your way through smaller issues as resources allow. And in the meantime, Omegas suffer, Celeste said bitterly. In the meantime, Omegas suffer less than they did before you became queen, Roman countered. That's progress, Your Majesty. Not perfection, but progress. And sometimes progress is all we can hope for. Nick sat down on Celeste's other side, his hand finding hers. He's right. You're trying to undo 8 years of systematic oppression in 7 days. That's not realistic. But every Omega you reassign, every abusive alpha you prosecute, every policy you reform, that's one less wolf suffering, one more wolf who might survive. That has to be enough, or you'll break yourself trying to save everyone at once. Celeste looked between them, Roman with his pragmatic advice, Nick with his brutal honesty, and realized they were both right. She couldn't save everyone, couldn't fix everything, but she could save some, fix some, make the world incrementally better for wolves who desperately needed incremental better. Okay, she said finally. We start with the breeding facilities. Full inspection, honest assessment, and real reform proposals. Then we address the territory tour, the ration investigation, the retaliatory abuse documentation, one bite at a time. That's my queen, Nick murmured, pride clear in his voice. One more thing, Celeste added. I want Priscilla involved. She's been hiding in the guest quarters for a week, processing trauma and avoiding the world. She needs purpose, needs to feel useful, and she has insight into Omega experiences that even I don't have. So I'm appointing her as my personal advisor on Omega affairs. Official position, official salary, official protection. She's barely recovered, Nick pointed out. Are you sure she's ready for that kind of responsibility? No, Celeste admitted. But I also know that healing happens faster when you have something to fight for. And giving her power over the system that tried to break her, that might be exactly the medicine she needs. Roman smiled. Smart. Cruel in a way. Forcing her to confront the system before she's fully healed. But smart. She'll either rise to the challenge or break completely. She'll rise, Celeste said with certainty she didn't entirely feel. Because we're Anderson women. And Anderson women don't break, we burn the world down and build something better from the ashes. Nick laughed, dark and genuine. I really did luck out with this mate bond. The moon goddess gave me a queen, with a spine of steel wrapped in compassion. I'm either the most blessed alpha in the territories, or the most cursed. Both, Celeste said, echoing his earlier words, definitely both. And there in that circular chamber with windows overlooking territories that desperately needed reform, with her monster mate beside her and an impossible task ahead, Queen Celeste Skinner made peace with the fact that changing the world would be messy and complicated and painful. But it would also be worth it. Because every wolf saved was a victory, every policy reformed was progress. And every day she woke up with a crown on her head and power in her hands was another day she could use that power to make good on the promise she'd made to herself 7 days ago. She would tear down the system Nick had built. And then she'd help him build something better. One impossible, devastating, necessary bite at a time. Chapter 10. The Breeding Facility. The southern breeding facility was hidden in plain sight, a converted estate on the edge of the territory, surrounded by high walls and guards who checked credentials twice before allowing entry. From the outside, it looked like any other high-security crown property, clean, well-maintained, almost pleasant. Inside it was a nightmare wrapped in sterile efficiency. Celeste walked through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and fear, Nick silent beside her, Roman trailing with a tablet to document everything they witnessed. The facility director, a beta named Richard Hines who'd run the program since its inception, led them with professional pride, clearly expecting praise for his management. We maintain the highest standards, Richard explained as they passed dormitory-style rooms with multiple beds. Regular medical checkups, adequate nutrition, exercise regimens designed to optimize reproductive health. Our success rate is 73%, well above initial projections. Success rate, Celeste repeated, her voice carefully neutral. You mean forced pregnancies that result in live births? Richard's smile faltered. We prefer to call them scheduled reproductions. Your Majesty. Forced implies coercion, when in reality we're simply fulfilling crown mandates for population recovery. Celeste stopped walking. Show me where the Omegas who refuse scheduled reproduction are taken. Something flickered in Richard's eyes, unease quickly masked. Your Majesty, perhaps we should continue the general tour first. The medical wing has some impressive innovations. Show me. Celeste interrupted, her voice dropping to something cold and dangerous. Where you take Omegas who say no. Richard swallowed hard. He glanced at Nick, clearly hoping for intervention. Nick's expression was carved from stone, offering no support, no escape. This way, Richard finally said, leading them down a side corridor to a wing clearly separate from the main facility. The moment they entered, Celeste knew. The air was different here, heavier, tinged with the chemical smell of sedatives. The doors had locks on the outside, And from behind one of those doors came a sound that made Celeste's blood freeze low, keening sobs that spoke of despair so complete it had transcended language. "This is our compliance adjustment wing," Richard said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "For omegas who demonstrate persistent resistance to program participation, we use a combination of counseling, pharmaceutical intervention, and when necessary gentle coercion to help them understand their duty to the realm." "Gentle coercion," Celeste said flatly. "Define that." Richard's jaw tightened. "Sedation during scheduled reproduction. It reduces psychological trauma while still allowing the program to function. Most omegas don't even remember the experience afterward. We consider it a mercy." The world tilted. Celeste felt Nick's hand on her back, steadying, grounding. The only thing keeping her from ripping Richard's throat out with her bare hands. Through the bond, she felt his rage matching hers, barely controlled violence singing beneath his skin. "Open that door," Celeste commanded, pointing to the room where the sobbing originated. "Your Majesty, the omega in that room is currently in adjustment. Open the door." Richard fumbled with keys, clearly regretting agreeing to this tour. The door swung open, revealing a small room with a single bed, restraints hanging from the frame, and a young omega curled in the corner no older than 20, her eyes glazed from whatever drugs they'd pumped into her system. Celeste recognized her from Angelo's list. 8 years. This girl had been here for 8 years, since she was barely more than a pup herself. "What's your name?" Celeste asked gently, crouching down to the girl's level. The omega's eyes struggled to focus. Amy Smith. But they call me Subject 17 here. Everyone's a number. How many times have they drugged you, Amy?" "Lost count." Her voice was slurred, broken. Maybe 20 times? 30? They keep saying it's my duty. That I should be grateful. That I'm helping rebuild the wolf population." A single tear tracked down her cheek. "But I just wanted to be a teacher. Before the conquest, I was studying to be a teacher." Celeste felt something inside her chest crack, not break, but transform into something harder, sharper, more dangerous than anything she'd experienced before. She stood, turned to Richard with a smile that made the beta step backward. "You're relieved of duty," she said calmly. "Effective immediately. Roman, take Director Hines into custody. Charges include systematic sexual assault, unauthorized drugging of crown property, and conspiracy to commit treason against the throne." Richard's face went white. "Your Majesty, I was following crown mandates. Everything I did was authorized by." He looked at Nick desperately. Tell her this was your program, your orders." Nick stepped forward, his voice soft and lethal. "My orders were to establish breeding facilities to address population decline. My orders were not to drug omegas into compliance. Were not to turn wolves into numbers. Were not to create a system where 20-year-old girls who wanted to be teachers spend 8 years as Subject 17 in a room with restraints on the bed." He grabbed Richard by the collar, lifting him off the ground with one hand. "You took my pragmatic solution to a crisis and turned it into a torture chamber. You wore duty to the realm as a shield while you systematically destroyed wolves who couldn't fight back. And now you're going to pay for every single omega you broke in my name." He threw Richard at Roman's feet. "Take him. Standard interrogation protocols find out which other staff members were complicit, which alphas requested specific omegas, which officials knew about the drugs and did nothing. I want a full accounting within 72 hours. Roman hauled Richard to his feet, already calling for guards. "With pleasure, Your Majesty." As they dragged the protesting beta away, Celeste turned back to Amy. "Can you stand?" I think so." Amy tried to get up, her legs shaking from drugs and prolonged restraint. Celeste caught her before she could fall. "I'm shutting this facility down," Celeste said quietly. "All 3 facilities, effective immediately. Every omega here will be reassigned either to palace duties under my direct supervision, or to voluntary placements where they'll have choice and autonomy." "And Amy?" She helped the girl sit on the bed. "If you still want to be a teacher, I'll fund your education personally. Crown scholarship, full tuition, whatever you need to build the life this system stole from you." Amy stared at her like she'd offered the moon. "Why? Why would you do that for me?" "Because 8 years ago my sister almost ended up here," Celeste said honestly. Because I could have been Subject 17 just as easily as you. Because the only difference between us is luck and timing, and the moon goddess's twisted sense of humor. She squeezed Amy's hand. And because you deserve better than this. Every Omega here deserves better than this. She stood, addressed the guards who'd followed them on the tour. Spread the word through the facility: no more scheduled reproductions, no more drugs, no more numbers. Every Omega gets their name back. And tomorrow, we start interviews to determine placements based on what they want, not what the realm needs from them. Your Majesty. One of the guards ventured nervously. What about the population decline? If we shut down all 3 facilities without an alternative, then we figure out an alternative, Celeste said firmly. We offer incentives for voluntary breeding. We create support systems that make parenting attractive. We build a world where Omegas choose to have pups because they want families, not because they're drugged into compliance. She looked at Nick. We do it right, or we don't do it at all. Nick nodded slowly, something complicated moving behind his eyes. You heard your queen. Shut it down. All of it. And anyone, staff, guards, administrators who protests, gets investigated for potential complicity in what happened here. The next 8 hours were chaos. They visited all 37 Omegas in the southern facility, hearing stories that ranged from heartbreaking to enraging. Some had been there 6 months. Others, like Amy, had been trapped for the program's entire existence. All of them were traumatized. Broken. Hollowed out by a system that treated them as reproductive machinery. But underneath the trauma, Celeste saw something else: hope. Fragile and tentative. But real. Hope that maybe the Alpha Queen's promises weren't just another beautiful lie. By sunset, the facility was in full evacuation mode. Omegas were being transported to temporary housing in the Citadel, where Dr. Daniels and his expanded medical team waited to provide care. The eastern and northern facilities received urgent messages: cease all scheduled reproductions immediately pending royal investigation. And Richard Hines was in the dungeons, singing like a bird about every official who'd known about the drugs. Every Alpha who'd requested specific Omegas for the program. Every detail of 8 years of systematic abuse conducted under the banner of population recovery. Celeste stood in what had been the facility's main dormitory, now empty except for her and Nick. The beds were neatly made, the rooms spotlessly clean, everything designed to look humane and necessary. She'd never hated a place more in her entire life. I enabled this, Nick said quietly, his voice rough. Created the conditions that let Richard turn pragmatic policy into torture. I knew the facilities existed, knew they were forcing reproduction. But I told myself it was necessary, told myself the ends justified the means. You didn't know about the drugs, Celeste said. Didn't know about the restraints, the numbering system, the way they stripped these Omegas of everything that made them individuals. I should have known. Nick's hands clenched into fists. Should have inspected personally. Should have done more than read sanitized reports from directors who had every reason to hide the worst abuses. He turned to face her, and Celeste saw guilt eating him alive. This is what you meant, isn't it? When you said I'd become the thing I fought against. I destroyed the old system because it treated Omegas like property, then built a new system that did the exact same thing with better paperwork. Yes, Celeste said honestly. But Nick, that's why I'm here. That's why the moon goddess bound us together. Not to punish you with a mate who'd constantly challenge your decisions, but to give you the conscience you'd lost somewhere in 8 years of brutal pragmatism. She crossed to him, took his face in her hands. You made terrible choices, created systems that harmed thousands of wolves. But you're also the reason I have the power to shut those systems down. The reason I can stand in this facility and decree its closure without worrying about being overruled or ignored. She kissed him soft and fierce and complicated. So yes, you enabled this. And yes, you need to own that horror. But you're also enabling the solution, giving me the authority and support to fix what you broke. That has to count for something. Nick pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. I don't deserve you. Probably not, Celeste agreed. But the moon goddess doesn't deal in deserving. She deals in necessity. And apparently we're necessary for each other, you to give me power, me to make sure you don't become a monster wearing that power. They stood like that for a long moment. 2 wolves holding each other in the wreckage of good intentions gone catastrophically wrong. What happens now? Nick asked finally. Now we go back to the Citadel and figure out population decline solutions that don't involve systematic rape, Celeste said. We offer Crown-funded parenting support, child care assistance, education stipends for Omega mothers who choose to have families. We make having pups attractive instead of forced. That will take years to implement, Nick pointed out. And cost a fortune. And might not work at all. Then it takes years, and costs a fortune, and might not work, Celeste replied. But at least we'll be trying something that doesn't involve drugging 20-year-olds who wanted to be teachers. Nick's laugh was bitter. You're going to bankrupt my treasury with compassion. Our treasury, Celeste corrected. And yes, probably. But I'd rather rule a poor kingdom with a clear conscience than a wealthy one built on the backs of tortured Omegas. That, Nick said, pulling back to look at her, is why you're going to be a better queen than I ever was a king. They returned to the Citadel near midnight, exhausted and emotionally raw. The relocated Omegas from the southern facility were being processed through medical intake, their stories documented, their needs assessed. It would take weeks to fully transition all 217 breeding program Omegas into new placements. But the work had begun. Priscilla was waiting in their private chambers the first time she'd voluntarily sought them out since Donnelly's execution. She'd heard about the facility closure, about Celeste's decree, about the reforms coming. You actually did it, she said, wonder in her voice. Shut down the breeding facilities. Just like that. Just like that, Celeste confirmed, sinking into a chair with Nick beside her. Though the consequences are going to be complicated. We've just eliminated a major source of pup production with no immediate replacement. The population decline will accelerate. Territory alphas will panic. And some wolves will see this as proof that the queen's compassion is dangerous. Let them see it, Priscilla said fiercely, something of her old fire returning. Let them panic. Because what you did today, what you both did, saved hundreds of wolves from hell. That matters more than population statistics or political stability. She sat down across from them, her posture more confident than Celeste had seen in weeks. I've been thinking about your offer. The position as your advisor on Omega affairs. I want it. Priscilla. You're still healing. I'll never be done healing, Priscilla interrupted. The things Donnelly did. The trauma from those 3 months, that's part of me now. It doesn't go away just because he's dead. But I can choose what I do with it. I can let it break me, or I can use it to make sure no other Omega suffers the same way. She leaned forward, intensity burning in her eyes. You need someone who's lived through the worst of Crown property treatment, who understands viscerally what it's like to be helpless and used and discarded. I can be that voice. Can tell you when your reforms aren't going far enough, when you're being too cautious, when compassion should override pragmatism. Celeste looked at her sister, not the broken, hollow wolf who'd arrived a week ago, but someone stronger, someone tempered by suffering into something sharp and purposeful. Okay, she said. The position is yours. Official appointment announced tomorrow. You'll work directly with me and the Queen's Council, help develop policy, and serve as the voice for Omegas who can't speak for themselves. One condition, Priscilla said. I want access to all the files. Every Omega placement, every complaint filed, every black tab in those ledgers. I want to know exactly how bad the situation is, so we can properly address it. Done, Celeste agreed. She glanced at Nick. Unless His Majesty objects. My queen has made her decision, Nick said simply. And I learned today that questioning her judgment on Omega welfare is a waste of breath. Priscilla gets full access. Roman will coordinate. He stood, offered his hand to Celeste. Come on, little queen. You've had the longest day of your reign. You need rest. Celeste took his hand, let him pull her to her feet. But she paused at the door, looking back at Priscilla. Thank you, she said quietly, for choosing to fight instead of hiding, for turning your pain into purpose, for being brave enough to help me change this broken world. Priscilla smiled, still fragile, still haunted, but real. We're Anderson women. We don't break, we burn the world down and build something better from the ashes. You taught me that. Actually, Celeste admitted, I made that up about 3 hours ago. But it sounds good, so let's pretend it's a family motto. Priscilla's laugh echoed through the chamber the first time Celeste had heard that sound in months. It was broken and tentative, but it was there. And that was enough. Later that night, Celeste stood on the balcony overlooking the territories, Nick's arms wrapped around her from behind. The moon was full, painting everything in silver light. In the distance, she could see the city lights, the territories she'd sworn to protect, the realm she'd inherited through 3 nights of hell and a mate bond that refused to let her quit. "What are you thinking?" Nick murmured against her hair. "That 2 weeks ago, I was an Omega nobody wanted on an auction block, convinced my life was over," Celeste said. "And now I'm queen. I've executed a beta commander, shut down breeding facilities, established a permanent council, and fundamentally challenged the foundation of your regime." "It's insane." "It's magnificent," Nick corrected. "You're magnificent, terrifying and compassionate and absolutely relentless in pursuit of what you believe is right." His arms tightened around her. "I'm still not sure if the moon goddess blessed me or cursed me by binding us together. But I'm grateful either way. Even though I'm dismantling everything you built?" "Especially because you're dismantling what I built," Nick said. "Because what I built was necessary but not good, pragmatic but not just. It kept wolves alive, but it didn't give them reason to be grateful for that survival." He turned her to face him. "You're building something better. Something that might actually deserve loyalty instead of just demanding it through fear." Celeste looked up at her monster, turned mate the Alpha King, who'd conquered territories and enslaved thousands, who'd created systems that tortured in the name of necessity, who'd become exactly the thing he'd fought against. But she also saw the wolf underneath. The one who'd loved his sister enough to break the world when it killed her. The one who stood beside Celeste even when her reforms challenged everything he believed. The one who was trying genuinely, painfully trying to be better than the monster circumstance had made him. "I love you," she said, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "I love you for being terrible and honest and broken. For giving me power and letting me use it against you. For standing in that breeding facility and owning your role in creating it instead of defending yourself." She pressed her palm over his heart. "You're not a good wolf, Nick Skinner, but you're mine. And I'm going to spend the rest of our lives making sure you remember that being mine means being held accountable for every terrible choice you make." Nick's smile was complicated, equal parts relief and resignation, and something that looked almost like hope. "I love you too, little queen. My conscience. My redemption. My gorgeous, terrifying mate who's going to be the death of me." He kissed her deeply. "Now come to bed. Tomorrow we have to deal with the political fallout from today's decisions, but tonight I just want to hold you and remember why surviving those 3 nights was worth it." Celeste let him lead her back inside, to the massive bed they'd begun sharing, to the intimate space where Alpha King and Omega Queen were just Nick and Celeste, 2 wolves bound by fate and choice, and the desperate hope that together they could build something better than what came before. She'd survived 3 nights in the Alpha King's bed to earn her freedom. And then she'd chosen to stay anyway, not as his prisoner or his toy, or some broken Omega he'd claimed as property, but as his equal, his mate, his queen. Together, they'd burn down the world he'd built. And from the ashes, they'd create something neither of them could have accomplished alone. A realm where strength mattered but compassion mattered more. Where Omegas had voices and choices and the right to be seen as more than just property or numbers or wombs for the next generation. It would take years, maybe decades. There would be setbacks and failures and moments when the task seemed impossible. But Celeste had learned something important during those 3 nights of trials. She was stronger than she'd ever imagined, braver than anyone expected, and absolutely relentless when it came to protecting wolves who couldn't protect themselves. She was Queen Celeste Skinner, and she was just getting started. Epilogue, 1 year later. The anniversary celebration of the mate bond was smaller than Nick had wanted, and larger than Celeste preferred a compromise that characterized most of their reign. They stood in the throne room, watching as the first graduating class of the Crown Academy received their teaching certificates. 32 Omegas who'd spent the past year in intensive education training, preparing to open schools throughout the territories. Schools where Omega pups would learn they had value beyond their designation, where strength wouldn't be the only measure of worth. Amy Smith stood at the front of the class, her teaching certificate clutched in trembling hands, tears streaming down her face, as Celeste personally handed her the official crown seal of approval. "You did it," Celeste said quietly. "Survived 8 years of hell. and still became the teacher you always wanted to be. Because you gave me the chance, Amy replied. Because the Queen remembered that Subject 17 had a name, had dreams, had value beyond reproductive capacity. She smiled through her tears. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure Omega pups know they're worth more than what the world tries to reduce them to. That's my promise to you, Your Majesty. That's how I repay what you did. After the ceremony, Celeste found Nick on their private balcony, watching the sunset paint the territories in shades of gold and amber. Population is down another 3%, he said without preamble. The incentive programs are helping, but not fast enough to counteract the breeding facility closures. In 10 years we might face critical shortages in some territories. And yet you're not demanding I reopen the facilities, Celeste observed, slipping her hand into his. Because I learned something this year, Nick said. Some problems don't have good solutions. Just less terrible ones. And forcing Omegas into sexual slavery to maintain population numbers is a cure worse than the disease. He pulled her close. We'll figure it out. Immigration incentives from other regions. Technology to support smaller pack structures. Maybe even alliance marriages that are actually consensual instead of arranged by alphas for territorial gain. Look at you, Celeste teased. The monster learns to problem solve without systematic oppression. I'm so proud. Don't get too proud, Nick replied. I executed 4 alphas last month for retaliatory abuse of crown property. I'm still plenty monstrous. Yes, Celeste agreed. But you're my monster. And those executions were justice, not cruelty. There's a difference. They stood in comfortable silence, watching their realm settle into twilight. In the year since Celeste became queen, they'd reformed labor laws, established education programs, created appeals processes for Omega placements, and fundamentally challenged centuries of pack hierarchy. It wasn't perfect, it would never be perfect, but it was better. And better was enough. Priscilla sent her monthly report, Celeste said. She's identified 17 more placements that need intervention. Including one in Lynn Donovan's territory. Nick sighed. Of course it is. Lynn's been pushing boundaries for months, testing how far she can go before we slap her down again. Then we slap her down again, Celeste said simply. As many times as necessary, until she learns that the Queen's decrees aren't suggestions. I really did luck out with this mate bond, Nick murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. The moon goddess gave me a queen who's more ruthless than I am when it comes to protecting her people. Not ruthless, Celeste corrected. Just unwilling to accept that any Omega's suffering is acceptable losses. There's a difference. Is there? Nick asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Yes, Celeste said firmly. Because my ruthlessness comes from compassion, not pragmatism. I don't sacrifice wolves because it's strategically sound. I sacrifice my reputation, my political capital, sometimes even my relationship with you to protect wolves who can't protect themselves. That's not ruthless. That's just being the queen they deserve. Nick was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled, genuine and warm and so different from the cold, cruel expressions that had characterized his early reign. You're right, he said. And I'm grateful every day that you chose to stay. That you took the power I offered and used it to become exactly what this realm needed, a queen who remembers what powerlessness feels like and refuses to let it continue. As night fell over the territories, Celeste leaned into her mate's embrace and thought about the journey that had brought them here. 3 nights of trials that felt like a lifetime ago. An auction block where she'd been nobody. A mate bond that had seemed like a curse but turned out to be salvation. She'd survived to earn her freedom, and then she'd used that freedom to free others. One decree at a time. One reformed policy at a time. One rescued Omega at a time. It was slow. It was frustrating. It was nowhere near enough, but it was better than before. And better, Queen Celeste Skinner had learned, was the only victory that mattered when you were trying to change the world.